The one they said a woman couldn't save a dying farm alone. They said the wheat would rot in the fields before autumn came. They said Evelyn Hart would lose everything her father built. But they didn't know about the stranger who rode in on a chestnut horse, a man with secrets darker than Montana soil and hands strong enough to rewrite her fate. This is the story of a promise born in death, a debt paid in blood and sweat, and a love that bloomed where only dust should have grown. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The morning Thomas Hart died, the sky broke open like a wound. Evelyn heard it first, the wet, rattling gasp that pulled her from the kitchen where she'd been grinding coffee beans her father would never taste. She dropped the wooden grinder and it clattered across the floor as she ran, her boots heavy on the pine boards worn smooth by 3 generations of Harts, who'd walked these same halls, lived these same struggles, dreamed these same impossible dreams of prosperity on the unforgiving Montana frontier. Her father lay in the iron bed that had been her mother's deathbed 6 years prior, his face the color of old candle wax, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate movements that seemed to cost him everything. The tuberculosis had been eating him alive for months, turning a man who once could lift a full-grain sack over each shoulder into this fragile shell, all bone and determination. "Papa?" Evelyn's voice cracked as she knelt beside him, taking his hand. His fingers were cold, so cold, even though the late August heat made the bedroom feel like the inside of a kiln. Thomas Hart opened his eyes, those sharp blue eyes that had always seen through her childhood lies and teenage rebellions, that had looked at her with such fierce pride when she'd learned to break a horse at 14, that had filled with tears the day her mother died and left them alone in this endless sea of wheat and wind. "Evelyn?" Her name came out like a prayer. "My girl." "Don't talk, Papa. Save your strength." She squeezed his hand, feeling the pulse there, weak, irregular, fading like a candle in a storm. "No." He coughed, and blood flecked his lips. Evelyn wiped it away with the corner of her apron, the same apron her mother had sewn, the fabric soft from years of washing. "No time for saving anything. Listen to me." She leaned closer, her dark hair falling forward to curtain them in a private world where death wasn't waiting just beyond the next breath. "The wheat," Thomas whispered. "It's ready. Another week, and it'll be too late. The grain will shatter, fall to the ground. Everything we worked for, everything your mother and I built." "I know, Papa. I know." Evelyn blinked back tears that burned like acid. Outside the window, she could see the wheat fields stretching toward the horizon, acre upon acre of golden grain, heavy with seed, bending in the wind like an ocean of honey and sunlight. 40 acres of prime wheat, the best crop they'd had in 5 years. Enough to pay off the banknote, enough to see them through the winter with money to spare, enough to finally get ahead instead of just surviving. But it all needed to be harvested, cut, bundled, threshed, stored, and there was only her. "Promise me." Thomas gripped her hand with surprising strength, his eyes blazing with a fever that had nothing to do with the disease consuming him. "Promise me you won't lose this farm. Your grandfather cleared this land. Your mother's buried here. This is Hart land, Evelyn. This is your birthright. Promise me." The words caught in her throat, thick and choking. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she was 23 years old and strong, but not strong enough to harvest 40 acres alone. That the neighbors were too busy with their own crops to spare time for a dying man's daughter. That the bank was already circling like vultures, just waiting for Thomas to breathe his last so they could foreclose on the note and sell the land to Henry Blackwood, the cattle baron who'd been trying to buy out every small farmer in the valley for the past 3 years. But she couldn't say any of that. Not to her father. Not while he lay dying. "I promise, Papa." Her voice was steady even as her heart shattered. "I won't lose the farm. I swear it." Thomas Hart smiled then. A real smile, the first she'd seen in weeks. His grip relaxed and he settled back into the pillows, his breathing easier despite the blood and the death rattling in his chest. "That's my girl," he whispered. "Strong like your mother, stubborn like me." He coughed again, weaker this time. "The scythe is sharp. I made sure yesterday, knew you'd need it." "Papa, please." "And remember, but The north field drains poorly. Cut there first in case of rain. His eyes were starting to glaze, focusing on something beyond the ceiling, beyond the room, beyond the world where his daughter knelt beside him with tears streaming down her face. I remember everything you taught me. Good girl. Thomas's voice was barely a whisper now, fading like smoke. Your mother, she's calling me. Can you hear her? Evelyn couldn't speak. She just held his hand and watched as the light slowly dimmed in her father's eyes, as his chest rose one final time and then went still, as everything she'd ever known and loved and relied upon slipped away into the vast, uncaring silence of death. She sat there for a long time after he was gone, holding his cooling hand, listening to the wind rattle the window panes and the wheat whisper its urgent, unforgiving demands outside. Finally, when the sun had climbed high enough to turn the bedroom golden, Evelyn Hart released her father's hand, stood on shaking legs, and walked outside to face the impossible task ahead. The scythe felt wrong in her hands. Evelyn stood at the edge of the north field, her father's ancient wooden-handled scythe gripped in both fists, staring at the ocean of wheat that rippled and swayed in the hot morning wind. The blade was sharp. Papa had kept his word even in his dying days, but it was also heavy, designed for a man's strength and a man's reach. She'd watched her father work this blade 1,000 times, watched the graceful arc of his swing, the way he moved down the rows with steady rhythm, the wheat falling in neat swaths behind him like golden soldiers surrendering to an inevitable tide. He'd made it look easy, even beautiful. But when Evelyn swung the scythe now, it felt like trying to cut water with a stone. The blade bit into the wheat stalk, sure enough, but her arc was wrong, the angle too high, and half the grain sprang back up instead of falling clean. She stumbled forward, regained her balance, and tried again. This time she cut too low, and the blade snagged in the stubble and nearly twisted out of her grip. "Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on, damn you!" She planted her feet wider, adjusted her grip, and swung again. Better. The wheat fell this time, mostly. She took a step forward and swung again, and again, and again. Within an hour, her shoulders were screaming. Within 2 hours, blisters had formed on her palms where the wooden handle rubbed. By noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and turned the field into a furnace, those blisters had burst and bled, soaking into the scythe handle and making her grip slippery. Evelyn stopped to catch her breath, leaning on the scythe like an old woman leaning on a cane. She looked back at what she'd accomplished, maybe a dozen rows, perhaps a 20th of just this one field. At this pace, it would take her weeks to cut even half the wheat, and by then the rest would have shattered and been lost. The mathematics of failure were brutally simple. She looked toward the house, where her father lay in his bed, waiting for someone to wash his body and prepare him for burial. She'd need to ride into town, report the death, arrange for the preacher and the undertaker. That would eat up the rest of today. Tomorrow she'd have to actually bury him, and people would come. Neighbors who'd offer sympathy, but not their labor. Townsfolk who'd bring casseroles and pity, but not solutions. And while she dealt with death, the wheat would keep ripening, keep waiting, keep threatening to fall and rot if she didn't somehow find a way to harvest it. "I promised you, Papa," Evelyn whispered to the wind. "I promised." But promises meant nothing to physics and biology and the cruel mathematics of labor and time. She was about to force herself back to work, to swing the scythe until her arms fell off if that's what it took, when she heard it. The sound of hoofbeats approaching on the dirt road that ran past the property. Evelyn turned, shading her eyes against the brutal noon sun, and saw a rider coming from the east. A lone man on a chestnut horse, moving at an easy walk, in no particular hurry. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. Tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty brown coat despite the heat, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. She frowned. She didn't recognize the horse or the rider, and strangers were rare out here. The Hart farm sat 5 miles from town, at the end of a road that didn't really lead anywhere except to the mountains beyond. People didn't just wander past. The rider slowed as he approached, then stopped at the fence line that separated the road from the wheat field. He sat there for a moment, looking at her, then at the wheat, then at the house in the distance. Finally, he dismounted with a slight hitch in his movements, a limp, Evelyn realized, and walked his horse to the fence. Up close, she could see he was probably in his early 30s, with several days of beard stubble darkening his jaw and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something careful in the way he moved, something deliberate, like a man who'd learned the hard way not to make sudden movements or draw unnecessary attention. "Ma'am?" He touched the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice was deep, roughened by dust and distance. "Name's Jack Harlow. I heard in town this place might need a hand for harvest." Evelyn stared at him, too tired and too grief-stricken to make sense of what he'd just said. "What?" "Harvest." He gestured at the wheat with one calloused hand. "I'm looking for work. Heard Thomas Hart's place might be hiring." The words hit her like cold water. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally found her voice. "My father died this morning." Something shifted in Jack Harlow's expression. Not surprise exactly, but a confirmation of something suspected. "I know. I heard he was sick. I'm sorry for your loss." Evelyn felt anger flare in her chest, hot and irrational. "If you knew he was sick, then you know I can't hire anyone. We don't have money for labor. We barely have money for anything." Jack was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. Finally, he said, "I didn't say anything about money, ma'am. I said, I'm looking for work. There's a difference." "I don't understand." "Let me work your harvest. I'll cut your wheat, help you get it stored and ready for market. When it's done and you've sold it, you can pay me whatever's fair, not before." He said it simply, like he was discussing the weather, not offering to potentially work for weeks without guarantee of payment. Evelyn's grip tightened on the scythe handle, and she felt the fresh blood from her torn blisters make the wood slick. This man was a stranger. She didn't know him, didn't know his history, didn't know why he'd ride 5 miles out of town to offer free labor to a woman he'd never met. Nothing in this world was free. Her father had taught her that. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why would you work for a promise instead of money in hand?" Jack was quiet again, and in that silence, Evelyn heard the wheat rustling around them, urgent and patient at the same time. Finally, he said, "Because sometimes a promise is all people have, and sometimes it's worth more than money." He gestured at the field, at the dozen rows she'd managed to cut in 4 hours of brutal labor. "That's good work, ma'am. Clean cuts, even bundling. But you're fighting a war you can't win alone. Not 40 acres of wheat in a week, maybe less. You need help." "I don't need charity." "Good. Because I'm not offering it." Jack's voice stayed level, but there was steel underneath now. "I work for my keep, ma'am. I'll sleep in your barn, eat what you feed your hired hands, and earn my wages through labor. When the crop is in and you've got money from the sale, you pay me a fair rate. Not charity, not a handout, a business arrangement." Evelyn wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to get back on his horse and ride away, wanted to not need his help so desperately that it made her chest ache. But she looked at the wheat, at the endless acres of it, and then down at her bleeding hands, and she knew the truth. Pride wouldn't save this farm. Stubbornness wouldn't keep her promise to her dying father. Only help would do that, even if it came from a stranger with storm cloud eyes and secrets she could sense hovering around him like shadows. "All right," she heard herself say. "But I'm warning you, Mr. Harlow. If you're running a con, if you think you'll work a few days and then claim I owe you the whole farm, you're making a mistake. I might be alone, but I'm not helpless. I know how to use my father's rifle, and I know how to use it well." Jack Harlow smiled then, just slightly, and for the first time she saw something genuine in his face. "Noted, ma'am. I'll try not to give you cause to shoot me." He tied his horse to the fence post and climbed over the rails with that slight limp slowing his movements but not stopping them. Up close, Evelyn could see he was even taller than she'd thought. At least 6 feet, with the kind of lean, rope muscle build that came from years of hard labor, rather than natural strength. "Show me where you want to start," he said simply. And just like that, everything changed. Jack Harlow worked like a man possessed. Evelyn showed him the north field where she'd been struggling, explained her father's reasoning about drainage and rain, then retreated to the house to deal with the grim necessities of death. She washed her father's body with trembling hands, dressed him in his Sunday suit, and arranged him on the bed with his hands folded over his chest. Then she rode into town to notify the undertaker and the preacher, to post notice of the death at the general store, to face the pitying looks and carefully worded questions about what she'd do now, a young woman alone on a failing farm. She wanted to scream at all of them that the farm wasn't failing, that she had help now, that she'd keep her promise. But she kept her mouth shut and her face composed and let them think what they wanted. When she returned home in the late afternoon, exhausted and hollowed out from grief and stress, she found Jack Harlow still in the field. He'd removed his coat despite the heat, working in just his shirt and vest, and the wheat fell before him in long, perfect swaths that looked like the work of a man who'd been born with a scythe in his hands. Evelyn stood at the fence and watched him work, mesmerized by the rhythm of it. His limp was barely noticeable now, just a slight hitch every few steps that didn't slow his pace. Swing, step, swing, step, swing, step, over and over, mechanical and tireless. He'd already cut more in 5 hours than she'd managed in 4, and the rows behind him were neat and orderly, the bundled wheat lying ready for stacking. She'd expected him to stop when he saw her return. Instead, he just raised one hand in acknowledgement and kept working, his face set in concentration, sweat soaking through his shirt. Evelyn went inside and started preparing supper. She didn't have much: beans, salt pork, bread she'd baked 2 days ago that was starting to go stale, some coffee that had been stretched with chicory to make it last. It was simple food, the kind you fed yourself when you were alone and too tired to care about taste. But Jack Harlow wasn't herself. He was a stranger working her fields, and even if she couldn't pay him yet, she could at least feed him properly. She found a chicken in the yard and killed it with quick efficiency, the way her mother had taught her. Plucked it, cleaned it, cut it into pieces, and fried it in the last of the bacon grease. Boiled potatoes with wild onions from the garden. Made a fresh pot of coffee, real coffee this time, no chicory. Set the table with her mother's good dishes, the ones they only used for special occasions. It wasn't a feast, but it was honest food, and she felt better having something real to offer. By the time full darkness fell, Jack finally stopped working. Evelyn heard him at the pump outside, washing up, and then his boots on the porch steps. He knocked, actually knocked, as if this wasn't his place to just walk in, and waited for her to invite him inside. "Supper's ready," Evelyn called. "Come in before it gets cold." Jack entered, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door with the automatic courtesy of a man raised with manners. His hair was dark with sweat and dust, and there were lines of exhaustion around his eyes, but he stood straight and tall, waiting for her to tell him where to sit. "There." Evelyn gestured at the chair across from hers, the one that had been her father's. She hesitated for just a moment. It felt wrong, letting a stranger sit in Papa's place, but then pushed the feeling aside. Her father was dead. That chair was just a chair now. Jack sat, and Evelyn brought the food to the table. She'd loaded his plate with most of the chicken and a generous helping of potatoes, keeping just a little for herself. She wasn't particularly hungry anyway. For a few minutes, they ate in silence. Jack had the manners to use his fork properly and to not speak with his mouth full, which spoke to some kind of decent upbringing. But there was something rough around the edges too, a hardness that came from years of difficult living. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "You cut more in one afternoon than I managed all morning." Jack looked up from his plate. "You were doing fine, ma'am, just fighting the wrong battle. A scythe that size, you need to let the weight do the work, not force it. Your father's tool was built for his height and reach. We can adjust the handle tomorrow, make it fit you better." "We?" "If you're planning to work alongside me, which I assume you are, given that fierce look you get when you swing that blade." There was the faintest hint of amusement in his voice, not mocking, but almost respectful. Evelyn felt something unknot slightly in her chest. "I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Harlow." "I can see that. And it's Jack, ma'am. Mr. Harlow makes me sound like I'm somebody important, which I assure you I'm not." "Then you can stop calling me ma'am. My name is Evelyn." "Evelyn?" He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. "That's a good name. Suits you." She didn't know what to say to that, so she focused on her food instead. After a moment, Jack spoke again. "I'll need to know more about your situation tomorrow. How much wheat, what condition the equipment's in, whether you've got contracts with buyers, or if you'll be selling direct. But tonight, If you don't mind my saying, you should rest. You've had about the worst day a person can have." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She'd been holding everything together through sheer force of will, but Jack's unexpected kindness threatened to crack that facade. "My father's viewing is tomorrow afternoon. I'll keep working the fields," Jack said quietly. "Pay my respects another time if that's all right. Funerals are for family and folks who knew the deceased. I'm just the hired hand." "You're not—" Evelyn stopped herself. What was he exactly? Not family, not a friend, not quite just hired labor either, given that he was working on faith and promises. "You're helping me keep a promise I made to my father. That makes you more than just a hired hand." Jack met her eyes across the table, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. Two people who'd both known loss and understood the weight of promises. "Then I'll be there tomorrow," he said simply, "to pay respects to the man whose daughter keeps her word." After supper, Jack took his plate to the wash basin and cleaned it himself, despite Evelyn's protests. Then he gathered his coat and hat and headed for the door. "The barn's clean," Evelyn said. "There's fresh straw in the loft and blankets in the trunk by the door. It's not much, but—" "It's more than I've had most nights these past few years," Jack interrupted gently. "Thank you, Evelyn." He left then, and Evelyn was alone in the house with her father's body laid out in the bedroom and a stranger sleeping in her barn and the impossible weight of 40 acres of wheat pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She should have felt afraid, or at least uncertain. Instead, as she cleaned up the supper dishes and banked the fire for the night, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. Thomas Hart's funeral was small but dignified. The preacher said the right words, and the neighbors who came, the Johnsons from the next farm over, the Martins from town, old Mr. Peterson who ran the general store, all offered their condolences with genuine sympathy. They lowered her father into the ground beside her mother, in the small family plot at the edge of the property, within sight of the wheat fields he'd loved. Evelyn stood dry-eyed through the whole ceremony. She'd cried herself out the night before, alone in her room, and now there was just a hollow emptiness where her father used to be. She accepted the handshakes and the murmured sympathies and the promises that people would check in on her with numb politeness. Mrs. Johnson, a plump woman with kind eyes and 8 children, pulled Evelyn aside after most of the others had left. "Dear, you know you can't stay out here alone. It's not proper and it's not safe. You should come stay with us for a while, at least until you figure out what to do with the farm." "I'm staying," Evelyn said firmly. "This is my home." "But the harvest, dear, is being taken care of." Evelyn gestured toward the fields, where Jack Harlow stood at a respectful distance, hat in hand, his head bowed in silent prayer. He'd shown up just as the service started, clean-shaven and wearing what was obviously his only good shirt, and had stood quiet and respectful through the entire ceremony. Mrs. Johnson followed her gaze and frowned. "Who is that?" "Jack Harlow. He's helping with the harvest." The frown deepened. "I've never heard of him. Where's he from?" "Does it matter?" Evelyn kept her voice level, but there was steel underneath. "He's a good worker, and he's helping me save my father's crop. That's all I need to know." Mrs. Johnson looked like she wanted to say more, probably something about propriety or reputation or the dangers of letting strange men work your farm, but Evelyn's expression must have warned her off. Instead, she just squeezed Evelyn's hand and said, "If you need anything, anything at all, you send word." "I will. Thank you." After everyone had left, Evelyn stood alone by the fresh grave, looking at the simple wooden cross that marked where her father now rested. She'd have a proper headstone made eventually, when the wheat money came in. For now, this would have to do. "I'm keeping my promise, Papa," she whispered. "I know you can't hear me, but I'm keeping it." She felt rather than heard Jack approach. He stood beside her, silent, just offering his presence. After a moment, he said quietly, "Your father must have been a good man to inspire that kind of loyalty." "He was the best man I knew." Evelyn's voice caught slightly. "He taught me everything, how to read the weather, how to judge when wheat is ready, how to keep books and manage a farm, how to be strong when everything tells you to give up. Those are good lessons." "They are." She turned to look at Jack, really look at him. In the afternoon light, with his hat off, she could see the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. "What about you? What did your father teach you?" Something flickered across Jack's face, pain maybe, or regret. "My father taught me that some men are born to lose everything they touch, and the best thing you can do is learn from their mistakes." It wasn't the answer she'd expected, and the bleakness of it shocked her. Before she could respond, Jack put his hat back on and stepped away from the grave. "I should get back to work. We've still got a lot of wheat to cut, and rain's coming in a few days. I can smell it." He was right. There was a heaviness to the air, a metallic taste that spoke of storm weather building. They didn't have time to waste on grief or questions about the past. "Let me change clothes," Evelyn said. I'll join you in the field." Jack nodded, then paused. "Evelyn, your father would be proud of you. Just wanted you to know that." He walked away before she could respond, heading back toward the fields where the wheat waited, patient and demanding. Evelyn stood by her parents' graves for one more moment, then straightened her shoulders and went to do the work that would keep her promise alive. They fell into a rhythm over the next few days. Up before dawn, when the world was still gray and cool, coffee and bread for breakfast, eaten quickly and mostly in silence. Then out to the fields, where Jack had already sharpened the scythes and laid out the plan for the day's work. He'd adjusted her father's old scythe to fit her height better, shortening the handle and rebalancing the blade, and now it moved more smoothly in her hands. She still couldn't match his pace. No one could, she thought, watching him work. But she could hold her own, cutting steady rows while he worked the more difficult sections where the wheat had tangled or the ground was uneven. They worked through the heat of the day, stopping only for water and a brief midday meal. Evelyn had never worked so hard in her life, not even during previous harvests when her father had been alive and healthy. Every muscle screamed, her hands bled despite the cloth wraps she'd bound them with, and by evening she was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open over supper. But the wheat kept falling, row after row, acre by acre. What had seemed impossible was slowly, painfully becoming possible. Jack fascinated her, though she tried not to let it show. He moved through the work with the kind of easy competence that came from years of practice, his limp barely noticeable now that she'd gotten used to his rhythm. He spoke little while working, saving his breath for the labor, but in the evenings over supper he'd talk, carefully, thoughtfully, like a man who'd learned to weigh his words. He told her about Kansas, where he'd tried and failed to build a life, about drought years when the sky stayed hard and blue for months without mercy, when cattle died by the dozens and crops withered in the fields, about debt that piled up faster than any man could work it off, until the bank came and took everything, the land, the livestock, the little house he'd built with his own hands. "Lost it all," he said one evening, his voice matter-of-fact but his eyes distant. "Every damn thing. Even lost my pride for a while there, which might have been the worst part." "Is that when you hurt your leg?" Evelyn asked carefully. She'd noticed he rubbed at his right knee sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, especially in the evenings after a long day's work. Jack glanced up, surprised she'd noticed. Then he nodded slowly. In a manner of speaking, "There was a day near the end when the bankmen came to clear me out. I didn't want to go quietly, got into it with one of their hired hands, and, well, let's just say I learned the hard way that fighting doesn't change anything except how much you hurt afterward." Evelyn could imagine it. Jack, younger and angrier, refusing to let strangers take what he'd built. The fight that followed, the injury that had left him limping, the helplessness of watching everything disappear anyway. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been terrible." "It was, but it taught me something important." Jack met her eyes across the table. "It taught me that pride is expensive, and sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let go of what you can't hold on to anyway. Took me a long time to learn that lesson, but I learned it." "Is that why you're here? Because you learned to let go?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Finally, he said, "I'm here because I learned that sometimes you get a chance to make things right, and you don't waste those chances, even if the making right comes years late." There was something else there, something he wasn't saying, but Evelyn didn't push. They all had secrets, she figured. Hers were buried in the family plot by the wheat fields. His were his own business. On the third night after the funeral, a storm rolled in. Evelyn woke to thunder that shook the house, the kind of deep, bone-rattling boom that spoke of serious weather. She got up and looked out the window, and in the lightning flashes she could see the wheat fields bending and thrashing in the wind, the stalks whipping back and forth like dancers in a violent ballet. Rain hit the roof like thrown gravel, and Evelyn's heart sank. If this turned into a real downpour, if it flooded the fields the way storms sometimes did in late summer, they could lose half the harvest. All their work would be for nothing. She dressed quickly and ran downstairs, intending to go check on the fields, maybe see if there was anything she could do to protect the cut wheat they'd already bundled and stacked. But when she opened the door, she found Jack already there, standing on the porch in his coat, staring out at the storm. "How bad is it?" she called over the wind. "Bad," Jack called back. "But not the worst I've seen. The North Field's going to flood for sure. It always does with this kind of rain. But the rest should be okay if the storm passes through quick." As if in answer, lightning cracked across the sky, so close and bright that Evelyn could see everything for a split second. The wheat, the barn, Jack's face stark and worried in the white light. Thunder followed immediately, a cannon-shot boom that made her ears ring. "We need to move the bundled wheat," Evelyn shouted. "Get it to higher ground before the water rises." "Too dangerous," Jack shouted back. "Lightning's too close. We wait it out." He was right. She knew he was right. But watching the storm tear at her father's fields made her want to scream with frustration. They'd worked so hard, cut so much wheat, and now nature was threatening to wash it all away. Jack must have seen something in her face because he reached out and caught her arm. "Evelyn, the wheat doesn't matter if you're dead. We wait." She wanted to argue, but another lightning strike, this one hitting a tree at the edge of the property, splitting it with a crack like the end of the world, convinced her he was right. They retreated into the house, and Evelyn slammed the door against the wind and rain. Inside, with the storm raging outside, the farmhouse felt small and fragile. Water was already starting to leak through the roof in the kitchen, dripping steadily into the bucket Evelyn quickly positioned. The walls creaked and groaned, and Evelyn found herself praying, something she hadn't done much since her mother died, that the house would hold. Jack shed his dripping coat and hung it by the door. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to his frame, and Evelyn realized with a start that he must have been outside for a while before she woke, probably checking on the fields, trying to secure whatever he could. "You're soaked," she said. I'll get you a towel." "I'm fine." "You're dripping on my floor. I'll get you a towel." She went to the linen cupboard and pulled out one of the thick towels her mother had woven years ago. When she came back, Jack was standing by the kitchen window, staring out at the storm-lashed darkness. "Here." She handed him the towel. "Thanks." He dried his face and hair, then turned to look at her. In the lamplight, with his hair wet and wild and those gray eyes serious, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something." "What?" Jack hesitated, and in that hesitation Evelyn felt something shift in the air between them, some confession hovering on the edge of speech. But before he could say whatever it was, another massive thunder crack made them both jump, and the lamp flickered dangerously. "Maybe this should wait till morning," Jack said finally. "No." Evelyn surprised herself with the firmness of her voice. "We're stuck inside until this storm passes, and we're both awake. If you've got something to say, say it." Jack studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He moved to the table and sat down heavily, like a man preparing to carry a weight. Evelyn sat across from him, in her father's chair, and waited. "I told you I came here looking for work," Jack began slowly. "And that's true, far as it goes. But it's not the whole truth." Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap, but she kept her face neutral. "Go on." 3 years ago, I was driving cattle through this territory. Had a small herd, maybe 30 head, that I'd scraped together after losing my place in Kansas. Thought if I could get them to market in Helena, I'd make enough to start over somewhere else. Jack's voice was steady, but his hands were gripping the edge of the table. There was a storm, not unlike this one. The cattle spooked and broke through a fence. By the time I got them rounded up, they'd trampled through someone's field, ruined about half an acre of wheat that was ready for harvest. Evelyn's breath caught. She remembered that summer, remembered her father cursing about cattle getting into the north field, remembered him being unusually quiet for days afterward. "That was you," she said softly. "You're the one who—" "Yeah." Jack met her eyes. "That was me. And your father. He would have been within his rights to shoot those cattle, or sue me, or call the sheriff. Instead, he helped me round them up, made me coffee, sat on his porch and told me about his daughter who'd just turned 20 and could outthink half the men in Montana, said she was going to do great things someday." Thunder rolled again, but softer now, the storm beginning to move off. In the quiet that followed, Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat, loud and fast. "He forgave me," Jack continued. "Didn't ask for compensation, didn't even seem angry, just said accidents happen, and a man's got to make his way in the world however he can. I tried to pay him something, but he refused. Said maybe someday I'd be in a position to help someone else, and that would be payment enough." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. That sounded like her father, generous to a fault, always believing the best of people, always willing to offer grace instead of judgment. "When I heard in town that Thomas Hart had died," Jack said quietly, "and that his daughter was facing harvest alone, I knew this was my chance to make it right, to pay back the debt I owed your father." He paused, then added, "At first, that's all it was, a debt to be paid." "At first?" Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. Jack's eyes held hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, not duty, but something deeper and more complicated. "At first, but then I met you, and I saw how hard you were willing to work, how fierce you were about keeping your promise. I saw your father in you, that same stubborn kindness, that same refusal to give up even when any sane person would. And I—" He stopped, shook his head. "I stopped doing this just because I owed your father a debt. I'm doing it because you deserve to keep this farm, because I believe in what you're fighting for." The storm had passed now, reduced to distant rumbles and the steady patter of rain on the roof. In the quiet, Evelyn could hear everything she'd been trying not to acknowledge. The way her heart jumped when Jack smiled, the way she'd started looking forward to their evening conversations, the way his presence had started to feel less like a stranger in her space and more like— what? A partner? A friend? Something more? "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I know that couldn't have been easy. Seemed wrong not to. You deserve to know why I'm really here. And now that I do know—" Evelyn took a breath. "Does anything change?" Jack looked at her and slowly he shook his head. "Not unless you want it to. I'm still here to finish this harvest, still planning to help you keep your promise. That doesn't change just because you know the whole story now." Evelyn stood up, suddenly restless, and walked to the window. The rain was lighter now, and in the east she could see the faintest hint of dawn starting to break. Another day was coming, bringing with it all the same challenges and impossible labor. But she didn't feel alone anymore. She turned back to Jack. "The storm's passing. We should try to get some rest before sunup. There'll be a lot of cleanup work to do once it's light enough to see." Jack stood, picking up his damp coat. "You're right." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Evelyn, I know I came here with my own reasons, my own debts to pay. But I want you to know, getting to know you these past days, working alongside you, seeing your strength, that's been worth more than paying off any old obligation. You're remarkable. Your father knew it, and now I know it too." Before she could respond, before she could process the warmth that spread through her chest at his words, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Evelyn stood alone in her kitchen, listening to his footsteps fade toward the barn, and pressed her hand over her racing heart. Outside, the rain fell softly, gently now, washing the wheat clean and watering the earth where her parents rested. And somewhere in the slowly lightening east, the sun was preparing to rise on another day of impossible promises and harvest work, and a growing connection between two people who'd both learned the hard way that sometimes the best things in life come from honoring old debts and keeping new promises. The wheat was waiting, and so was tomorrow. And for the first time since her father died, Evelyn found herself believing that both might actually bring something good. The morning after the storm dawned clear and merciless, the sun climbing into a sky scrubbed clean by rain. Evelyn woke to find her entire body protesting, every muscle stiff, every joint aching from days of relentless labor. For a moment, lying in her childhood bed with sunlight streaming through the lace curtains her mother had made, she let herself imagine staying there, burrowing into the quilts and surrendering to exhaustion. Then she heard it, the rhythmic sound of metal on stone, the distinctive ring of a blade being sharpened. Jack was already up, already preparing for another day of work. Evelyn threw off the covers and dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy with haste and lingering fatigue. When she made it downstairs and outside, she found Jack at the grinding wheel behind the barn, bent over the scythe blade with focused intensity. His shirt was already damp with sweat despite the early hour, and there was a set to his shoulders that spoke of determination bordering on obsession. "You should have woken me," Evelyn called as she approached. Jack looked up, and she was startled by the shadows under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. "Figured you needed the rest. You've been working yourself ragged." "So have you." She gestured at the scythe. "How bad is it out there?" Jack set down the blade and straightened, one hand going automatically to his right knee, rubbing at the old injury. "Could be worse. The north field flooded like I expected, and we lost maybe half of what we'd already cut and bundled there. But the rest held. The drainage worked like your father planned." Evelyn felt relief war with frustration. Losing half the north field was painful, but not catastrophic. They could recover from it if they worked fast enough to get the rest in before another storm hit. "How much time do we have?" "Hard to say. Weather's clear now, but there's more coming. I'd guess we've got 4, maybe 5 days before the next system moves through." Jack picked up the scythe again, testing the edge with his thumb. "We need to work faster. Push harder." "We're already pushing as hard as we can." "Then we push harder than that." There was something almost desperate in his voice, and Evelyn realized with a start that Jack was taking this as personally as she was. This wasn't just about paying a debt anymore. Somewhere in the past few days, he'd become as invested in saving this farm as she was. The realization sent a complicated flutter through her chest. Gratitude mixed with something warmer, something that made her very aware of how his wet shirt clung to his shoulders, how the morning light caught in his gray eyes and turned them silver. She pushed the thoughts away. There was no time for such foolishness, not with the wheat waiting and the weather threatening and everything she'd ever known hanging in the balance. "Then let's get started," she said firmly. "Show me what needs to be done." They worked through that day like demons possessed, barely stopping even for water. The flooded sections of the north field were a loss, the bundled wheat waterlogged and already starting to rot, but they salvaged what they could and then moved on to the sections that had survived. Jack pushed the pace relentlessly, and Evelyn matched him stroke for stroke, refusing to be the one who faltered first. By evening, they'd cut more in one day than they had in the previous 2 combined, but the cost showed in both of them. Jack's limp was pronounced now, his face tight with pain he was trying to hide. Evelyn's hands had bled through her wrappings, and her shoulders felt like they were on fire. At supper, beans and cornbread eaten in exhausted silence, Evelyn finally spoke. "You're hurting yourself. That knee can't take this pace." "I'm fine." "You're limping worse than you did 3 days ago, and don't think I haven't noticed you favoring that leg. If you injure yourself badly, we'll lose more time than if you just paced yourself properly." Jack set down his spoon with a deliberate calm that somehow felt more dangerous than anger. "I know my limits, Evelyn." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to prove something, and I can't figure out if you're trying to prove it to me or to yourself." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and challenging. Jack stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Maybe both," he admitted. "Maybe I'm trying to prove I'm not the same man who lost everything in Kansas. Maybe I'm trying to prove I can finish something I start, for once in my miserable life, or maybe—" He stopped, shook his head. "Maybe I just can't stand the thought of failing you." Evelyn's breath caught. "Jack, I know what it's like to lose everything, Evelyn. I know what it feels like to stand on land that was yours and watch strangers take it away. I know the kind of hollow that leaves inside you. His voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to contain. When I see you fighting so hard to keep this place, to honor your father's memory, to keep a promise that's eating you alive, I see myself 3 years ago, except you're stronger than I was. You're not giving up, and I'll be damned if I let you fail because I couldn't work hard enough. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. This isn't your failure to bear, Jack. This is my farm, my promise, my fight. I know that, but sometimes people need help carrying their burdens. Your father taught me that 3 years ago when he could have made my life hell and chose kindness instead. Let me help you carry this. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she didn't need anyone's help, that she could do this alone. But the truth was staring her in the face across the table. She couldn't do this alone. She'd been fooling herself to think otherwise. Without Jack, without his strength and skill and relentless determination, the wheat would have died in the fields and the bank would have foreclosed and her promise would have meant nothing. All right, she said softly, but we do this smart. We pace ourselves. We work hard, but not so hard we break. Because if you injure that knee badly enough that you can't work at all, then we really are finished. Agreed? Jack studied her face, then slowly nodded. Agreed. But that means you take care of yourself too. Those hands of yours are a mess, and you're favoring your left shoulder. Don't think I haven't noticed. Deal. Evelyn managed a tired smile. We'll both stop trying to kill ourselves and settle for merely working ourselves to the bone. Seems like a reasonable compromise. After supper, Evelyn brought out her mother's medical kit, a wooden box filled with herbs and tinctures and remedies passed down through generations. She made Jack sit at the table and roll up his right pant leg, ignoring his protests. The knee was swollen and hot to the touch, the old injury clearly aggravated by days of hard work. Evelyn mixed a poultice of comfrey and arnica, the pungent smell filling the kitchen, and wrapped it carefully around the joint. This'll help with the swelling, she said, tying off the bandage with practiced efficiency. And tomorrow, you're going to let me handle the sections where the ground is uneven. No arguments. Jack looked like he wanted to argue anyway, but something in her expression must have convinced him it was futile. Yes, ma'am. I thought we agreed you'd stop calling me ma'am. That was before you started ordering me around like a schoolmarm with a ruler. Seemed appropriate to bring it back. But there was warmth in his voice, almost affection, and Evelyn felt that flutter in her chest again. She busied herself putting away the medical kit, trying to ignore the way her heart was beating too fast, the way she was suddenly hyper-aware of how close they were standing, the way Jack's eyes followed her movements with an intensity that had nothing to do with wheat or harvests or old promises. Evelyn, Jack said quietly. She turned and found him standing now, closer than she'd realized. In the lamplight, with his hair still damp from washing and his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms marked with old scars and new bruises, he looked both dangerous and gentle, hard and kind, everything contradictory and somehow perfect. Thank you, he said simply, for trusting me, for letting me help, for not giving up when any sane person would have. I'm my father's daughter, Evelyn said, her voice not quite steady. We hearts are too stubborn to know when to quit. That's one of the things Jack stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. That's one of the things I admire about you. Your strength. Your loyalty. He was standing so close now that Evelyn could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and sun-dried cotton, could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her mouth went dry, and she forgot whatever response she'd been about to make. For a moment they just stood there, the air between them charged with possibility and want, and all the things neither of them had the courage or the time to say. Then Jack stepped back, the spell breaking like a soap bubble. I should let you rest, he said, his voice slightly rough. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. Yes, right, tomorrow. Evelyn felt like she was waking from a dream, disoriented and flushed. Good night, Jack? Good night, Evelyn. He left, and she stood alone in the kitchen, one hand pressed against her racing heart, wondering what the hell had just happened and whether she was brave enough to let it happen again. The next 3 days passed in a blur of brutal, unrelenting work. They were up before dawn and worked until they could barely see in the twilight. The wheat fell before them in endless rows, and slowly, impossibly, the fields began to look harvested instead of abandoned. Jack kept his word about pacing himself, and Evelyn did her best to do the same, though the urgency driving both of them made moderation feel like cowardice. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding of how to work together. Evelyn learned to anticipate when Jack would need water or when his knee was bothering him more than he'd admit. Jack learned to read the subtle signs of her exhaustion, the way her shoulders would start to droop, the slight tremor in her hands when she gripped the scythe. In the evenings, over simple suppers, they talked. Jack told her more about his past, about growing up in Missouri, about his mother who'd died when he was young, about his father's failed business ventures and bitter drinking and early death. He told her about the years he'd spent drifting, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough to put down roots or risk caring about anything. "Thought if I kept moving, I couldn't lose anything," he said one night, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. "Turns out you can lose things you never even knew you wanted. Time, mostly. The chance to build something real." Evelyn told him about her mother, Sarah Hart, who'd been beautiful and fierce and had died too young, leaving a hole in their family that never quite healed. She told him about growing up on the farm, about the isolation of it, the way other girls her age had been learning to dance and flirt while she was learning to drive a plow and manage accounts. "Sometimes I wondered what it would be like to be normal," she admitted. "To want the things other women want, a husband in town, a nice house, children, a life that didn't involve dirt under my fingernails and calluses on my hands." "Do you still wonder?" Evelyn considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I think about losing this place, about walking away from everything my parents built, and I know I couldn't do it. This farm is part of me. For better or worse, this is who I am." Jack reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he'd deliberately touched her since that charged moment in the kitchen days ago. His palm was warm and calloused, and Evelyn felt electricity spark at the contact. "Then I'm glad you are who you are," he said quietly, "because the world needs more people who know what's worth fighting for." On the fourth day after the storm, they finished the main fields, 40 acres of wheat cut and bundled and stacked, ready for threshing. It was backbreaking work, the kind that left them both so exhausted they could barely climb the porch steps. But it was done. Evelyn stood at the edge of the property as the sun set, looking at the neat rows of bundled wheat, at the evidence of their labor stretching in every direction. She felt tears of relief and exhaustion and pride spill down her cheeks, and didn't bother to wipe them away. Jack came to stand beside her, and they watched the sunset paint the bundled wheat gold and copper and bronze, turning their hard work into something almost beautiful. "We did it," Evelyn whispered. "My God, Jack, we actually did it." "You did it," Jack corrected gently. "This is your victory, Evelyn. Your promise kept." She turned to look at him, this man who'd ridden into her life at its darkest moment, who'd worked himself nearly to breaking to help her save everything that mattered, who'd become something she couldn't quite name but desperately wanted to keep. "Our victory," she said firmly. "I couldn't have done this without you. I wouldn't have even tried without you." Jack's expression softened, and he raised one hand to her face, his thumb gently wiping away the tracks of her tears. The gesture was unbearably tender, and Evelyn felt something crack open inside her chest. All the walls she'd built around her heart, all the defenses she'd maintained against wanting something beyond mere survival. "Evelyn," Jack said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and they both turned to look at the horizon. Dark clouds were building there, purple, black, and ominous, moving faster than Evelyn had ever seen clouds move. "No," she breathed. "No, not another storm. Not now." Jack's face had gone hard with worry. "That's not just a storm. That's a real system. Could be hail, could be flooding. Either way, if it hits before we can get the wheat under cover." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what it meant. All their work, all their sacrifice, all those brutal days of labor, it could all be destroyed in an hour if that storm hit with hail or high winds, or enough rain to flood the fields again. "The barn," Evelyn said, her mind racing. "We could move some of the wheat into the barn, at least protect part of the harvest." "Not enough room. Not for all of it." "Then we protect what we can and pray the rest survives." Evelyn was already moving, running toward the fields, her exhaustion forgotten in the face of this new crisis. "Come on! We don't have much time!" They worked like people possessed, carrying armfuls of bundled wheat toward the barn, racing against the approaching storm. The wind picked up, whipping Evelyn's skirts around her legs and tearing strands of hair from her braid. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes, and the smell of rain grew heavy in the air. Jack's injured knee gave out halfway through their third trip, and he went down hard in the dirt, cursing viciously. Evelyn dropped her bundle and ran to him, trying to help him up, but he waved her off. "Keep going!" he shouted over the rising wind. "Save what you can. I'll catch up. I'm not leaving you in the field. Evelyn, there's no time to argue. The wheat can rot for all I care if it means leaving you hurt." She got her shoulder under his arm and hauled him upright with strength born of desperation. "We do this together or not at all. Now move." They stumbled toward the barn together, Jack leaning heavily on her, both of them fighting the wind that seemed determined to knock them down. They'd barely made it inside when the first raindrops hit, fat, heavy drops that sounded like drum beats on the barn roof. Evelyn got Jack settled on a hay bale, then turned to look at their meager pile of saved wheat. They'd managed maybe 1/10 of the harvest, if that. The rest was still out in the fields, exposed to whatever violence the sky was about to unleash. "It's not enough," she said, despair creeping into her voice. "It's not nearly enough." Jack grabbed her hand, pulling her attention back to him. "Listen to me. We saved what we could. That's all anyone can do. The rest is up to God and luck, and whatever grace the universe sees fit to grant. But if we lose the crop, then we lose it. But Evelyn, we fought. We fought so damn hard. Your father would be proud of that fight, win or lose." The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. Rain hammered down in sheets so thick Evelyn couldn't see past the barn door. Thunder cracked overhead, so loud and close she felt it in her bones. Lightning turned the world white and black, in a strobe that made her dizzy. And underneath it all, the roar of wind and water, the sound of nature, reminding them just how small and powerless they really were. They huddled together in the barn, not for warmth, because the air was still stifling despite the wind, but for comfort, for the simple human need not to be alone when the world was ending around them. Evelyn found herself pressed against Jack's side, his arm around her shoulders, his heartbeat steady against her ear. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep inside. "I'm so scared, Jack. What if it's all for nothing? What if we lose everything anyway?" Jack's arm tightened around her. "Then you'll start again. Because that's what you do. You keep going. I've seen it in you these past weeks. You don't know how to give up. I'm tired of being strong. I'm tired of fighting." "I know. God, I know." He turned slightly, tilting her face up to look at him. In the lightning flashes, his eyes were fierce and full of things unsaid. "But you're not alone in this fight anymore, Evelyn. Whatever happens out there, whatever we face when this storm passes, we face it together. I'm not going anywhere. You don't owe me. This isn't about owing anyone anything. This is about—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. "Hell, I've never been good at this, at saying what I feel. But Evelyn, you have to know by now that I'm not here just because of some debt to your father. I'm here because of you. Because somewhere between that first day in the field and tonight, I stopped thinking about leaving and started thinking about staying. Started thinking about building something real, something that matters. With you." Evelyn's breath caught. "Jack, I know the timing's terrible. I know we're in the middle of a storm and we might lose everything and tomorrow might bring disaster. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that tomorrow isn't promised. So I'm saying it now while I have the chance. I care about you, Evelyn Hart, more than I've cared about anyone in a long damn time. And if you'll have me, if you want me to stay after the harvest is done and the debt is paid, then I will. Not as hired help, but as whatever you'll let me be." The barn felt suspended in time, caught between one heartbeat and the next. Outside, the storm raged with furious intensity, but inside, in this small bubble of hay-scented air and lamplight, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, to Jack's face inches from hers, to the rough warmth of his hand cradling her cheek, to the terrible, wonderful vulnerability in his eyes. "I want you to stay," Evelyn heard herself say, the words both terrifying and liberating. I don't know what tomorrow brings, or if there will even be a farm left to stay on, but I want you here, with me. I think I've wanted that since the moment you offered to work for a promise instead of wages. Jack's smile was slow and devastating, transforming his entire face from something hard and weathered into something almost boyish. Then I guess we're in this together, come what may. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, to change her mind, to remember all the practical reasons why this was foolish and dangerous and far too fast. But Evelyn didn't pull away. She met him halfway, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted like rain and salt and promise. It was nothing like she'd imagined a kiss should be. No gentle exploration, no tentative sweetness. It was desperate and fierce, full of all the fear and hope and longing they'd been holding back for weeks. Jack's hand tangled in her hair, and Evelyn's fingers gripped his shirt like she could anchor them both against the storm. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn pressed her forehead against his and laughed, a wild, slightly hysterical sound. We're insane. The world is falling apart outside, and we're kissing in a barn. Best moment of my life, Jack said seriously, then grinned, though I'll admit the timing could use work. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other while the storm raged outside, stealing moments of warmth and connection in the midst of chaos. Jack told her about Oregon, about the dreams he'd once had of seeing the ocean, of building a life on the coast where the weather was mild and the land was green. Evelyn told him about the time she'd snuck into town alone at 16 and gotten spectacularly lost trying to find her way home in the dark. They talked and kissed and held each other. And for those hours in the barn while the storm did its worst, Evelyn let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, happiness wasn't something that only happened to other people. Maybe she could have this, could have Jack and the farm and a future that stretched beyond mere survival. The storm passed sometime near dawn, the fury giving way to exhausted drizzle and then finally to silence. Evelyn woke to find herself curled against Jack's chest, his coat draped over them both like a blanket. For a moment she just lay there, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek. Then reality came crashing back, and with it, the terrible knowledge of what they'd have to face outside. Jack, she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. Jack, wake up. The storm's past. He woke instantly, the way people who'd learned to sleep light tended to do. For a second he looked confused, then his arms tightened around her briefly before he released her and sat up, wincing as his injured knee protested. How long did we sleep? A few hours, maybe. Evelyn stood, brushing hay from her skirts, trying to steel herself for what they'd find. We should go look. They walked out of the barn together into a world transformed. The sky was clear and innocent, washed clean by the storm, with the sun just beginning to paint the eastern horizon pink and gold. But the fields, Evelyn's heart sank. The fields were a disaster. Where neat rows of bundled wheat had stood the night before, now there was chaos. Bundles scattered and broken, stalks bent and flattened, everything soaked through and muddy. It looked like a giant had thrown a tantrum across the land, destroying for the sheer pleasure of destruction. Oh God, Evelyn breathed. Oh God, it's ruined. It's all ruined. She took a step toward the devastation, then another, her legs numb and her mind refusing to process the magnitude of the loss. All those days of brutal work, all those hours of pain and exhaustion and determination, gone. Destroyed in one night of wind and rain and cosmic indifference. She sank to her knees in the mud, not caring about her dress or her dignity or anything except the crushing weight of failure settling over her like a suffocating blanket. She'd promised her father. She'd sworn she wouldn't lose the farm. And now, Evelyn, Jack's voice, rough with his own pain, seemed to come from very far away. Evelyn, look at me. She couldn't. She just knelt there in the mud, staring at the ruins of her hope, feeling tears stream down her face without bothering to wipe them away. Evelyn, please. Jack's hands on her shoulders, gentle but insistent, pulling her to her feet. Please look. Really look. She forced herself to focus, to see beyond the immediate devastation. And slowly, gradually, she realized what Jack had already seen. Yes, the fields were damaged. Yes, there were bundles broken and wheat scattered and mud everywhere. But the wheat was still there, flattened but not drowned, wet but not rotting, damaged but not destroyed. It's salvageable, Jack said quietly. It'll take work, a lot of work, and we'll lose some to spoilage. But Evelyn, it's salvageable. We can still save this. Evelyn looked up at him, hardly daring to believe. Are you sure? I'm sure. I've seen worse damage recovered from. We'll need to work fast, get everything restacked and drying before mold sets in. But we can do this. He pulled her against him, holding her tight. We can do this, Evelyn. Together. She buried her face in his chest and cried, from relief, from exhaustion, from the sheer overwhelming weight of everything that had happened. Jack just held her and let her cry, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring reassurances that somehow made it through the storm of her emotions. Finally, when she had no tears left, Evelyn pulled back and wiped her face with her muddy hands, probably making the mess worse. I must look terrible. You look beautiful, Jack said simply, and the absolute sincerity in his voice made her believe him. Well, beautiful or not, we have work to do. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, feeling determination rise to replace despair. If we can still save this harvest, then that's what we're going to do, no matter how long it takes. Jack smiled, that devastating smile that made her heart skip, and offered her his hand. Then let's get started. We've got a promise to keep. They walked back toward the fields together, hand in hand, ready to begin again. And behind them, forgotten in the barn, the small pile of wheat they'd managed to save stood as proof that sometimes the smartest thing you can do is fight for every inch, protect what you can, and trust that enough small victories can add up to survival. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds, and Evelyn Hart squared her shoulders and went back to war with nature, time, and fate itself. But this time, she wasn't fighting alone. The work of salvaging the storm-damaged wheat was somehow worse than the original harvest had been. At least then they'd been working with standing grain, with neat rows and predictable patterns. Now they were dealing with chaos, bundles that had come apart in the wind, stalks that had been driven into the mud, wheat that had tangled together into impossible knots that had to be carefully separated and assessed for damage. Evelyn's back screamed as she bent to gather scattered stalks for what felt like the 1,000th time that morning. Her dress was caked with mud up to her knees. Her hair had long since escaped its braid and hung in wet tangles around her face, and her hands had started bleeding again despite the wrappings Jack had insisted she wear. But she kept working, because what else was there to do? Give up? Let the wheat rot where it lay? Break her promise to her father because nature had decided to test her one more time? Not a chance in hell. Jack worked beside her with the same grim determination, though she could see the toll it was taking on him. His face was gray with exhaustion, his limp more pronounced with each passing hour, but he never slowed, never complained. They'd developed a system. He'd lift the heavier bundles while she sorted through the scattered stalks, determining what could be saved and what was too damaged or waterlogged to bother with. It was brutal, mind-numbing work, and by midday, Evelyn felt like she'd aged 10 years. But slowly, painfully, the chaos began to transform back into order. Bundles were restacked, this time under the temporary shelter of canvas tarps Jack had rigged between poles. Damaged wheat was separated from salvageable grain. The mud began to dry in the climbing sun, making the work marginally easier. They were working on a particularly stubborn tangle of wheat near the north field when Evelyn heard the sound of an approaching wagon. She straightened, one hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt her stomach drop as she recognized the rig. Henry Blackwood. Of all the people she didn't want to see right now, the cattle baron who'd been circling her land like a vulture topped the list. Company, she said quietly to Jack, who looked up from his work and followed her gaze. Something in his expression hardened when he saw the wagon. Want me to send him away? Jack asked, his voice flat. Evelyn shook her head. No, I'll handle this. Just stay close? Always. The word sent a flutter through her chest despite the circumstances, but she pushed it aside as Blackwood's wagon pulled to a stop near the fence line. The man himself climbed down with the practiced ease of someone who spent more time on horseback than on foot. Tall, well-built, probably handsome if you liked your men slick and self-satisfied. He was wearing clothes that cost more than most farmers made in a season, and his boots probably cost more than Evelyn's entire wardrobe. "Miss Hart," Blackwood called, touching the brim of his expensive hat in a gesture that somehow managed to be both polite and condescending. "Heard you had some storm damage last night. Thought I'd come by and see if you needed any assistance." Evelyn walked toward the fence, very aware of how she must look, muddy, exhausted, barely holding together. But she kept her spine straight and her voice steady. "That's kind of you, Mr. Blackwood, but as you can see, we're managing just fine." Blackwood's eyes swept over the storm-damaged fields, and his expression suggested he thought managing was a generous description. "Are you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're fighting a losing battle, Miss Hart. No shame in admitting when you're beaten." "I'm not beaten." "Not yet, perhaps. But the banknote comes due in 6 weeks, doesn't it? And even if you manage to salvage some of this wheat, the market price won't be what you'd hoped. Storm damage means lower grade, and lower grade means less money." He said it gently, like he was breaking bad news to a child. "I'm prepared to make you a fair offer for the land, Miss Hart. Fair enough that you could pay off your father's debts and still have money left over to start fresh somewhere else." Evelyn felt anger burn hot in her chest. "This is my home, Mr. Blackwood. My family's land. It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price, and sentiment doesn't pay debts." Blackwood leaned against the fence, his posture casual, but his eyes sharp. "I know you think you're honoring your father's memory by holding on to this place, but what do you think he'd want? For you to work yourself to death trying to save a failing farm, or for you to accept help when it's offered? I think my father would want me to keep my promises, and I promised him I wouldn't lose this land. Promises made to dying men don't put food on the table, Miss Hart. They don't—" Blackwood stopped abruptly as Jack appeared at Evelyn's shoulder, his presence suddenly filling the space in a way that made the cattle baron take an involuntary step back. "The lady said the land's not for sale," Jack said quietly, but there was something dangerous in his tone. "Seems pretty clear to me." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he assessed Jack, taking in the mud-covered work clothes, the obvious exhaustion, the proprietary way he stood beside Evelyn. "And you are?" "Jack Harlow. I'm helping Miss Hart with the harvest." "I see." Blackwood's tone suggested he saw rather more than Jack had actually said. "Well, Mr. Harlow, I hope she's paying you in something other than promises, because from what I hear, this farm is one bad season away from foreclosure." "That's enough," Evelyn said sharply. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but it's not needed or wanted. My affairs are my own business." "For now," Blackwood agreed, straightening and adjusting his hat. "But when the bank comes calling, and they will come calling, Miss Hart, you remember that I made you a fair offer, because once they foreclose, they'll sell this land to whoever bids highest, and it might not be someone as generous as me." He climbed back into his wagon, tipped his hat one final time, and drove away, leaving Evelyn shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "Bastard," Jack said flatly, once the wagon was out of earshot. "He's not wrong, though," Evelyn said, her voice small. "About the banknote, about the market prices. Even if we save the wheat, if it's graded as storm damaged, then we make sure it's not graded as storm damaged." Jack turned to face her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "Evelyn, listen to me. That man wants you to fail. He's been waiting for your father to die so he could swoop in and buy this land cheap. Don't give him the satisfaction of being right." "But if the wheat is salvageable. I told you that. Yes, some of it took damage, but most of it's fine, just needs to dry properly and be threshed careful. We can still get top grade for the bulk of the harvest." His grip tightened slightly. "But you have to believe it's possible, Evelyn. Because if you give up now, then Blackwood wins and your father's promise dies, and everything we've worked for means nothing." Evelyn looked into Jack's storm-gray eyes and saw absolute conviction there. No doubt, no hedging, just pure stubborn belief that they could still pull this off. And somehow, impossibly, his certainty began to kindle something similar in her chest. "You really think we can do this?" "I know we can, but I need you to believe it too." She took a shaky breath, then nodded. "All right, then let's get back to work. We've got wheat to save and a cattle baron to prove wrong." Jack's smile was fierce and proud. That's my girl. The words sent warmth flooding through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. His girl. When had that happened? When had she gone from desperate farm owner accepting a stranger's help to someone who belonged to Jack Harlow and had him belonging to her in return? But there was no time to examine that question now. They had work to do. They worked until darkness made it impossible to continue, then stumbled back to the house for a late supper. Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to slice bread, and Jack finally took the knife from her gently and did it himself. "You need to rest," he said firmly. "Real rest, not just a few hours of sleep before we start again. We don't have time for rest. We don't have time for you to collapse from exhaustion either. Evelyn, you're running on empty. I can see it." She wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her by swaying slightly where she stood. Jack caught her elbow, steadying her, and the concern in his face made her throat tight. "I'm fine," she insisted weakly. "You're dead on your feet. Come on." He guided her to a chair at the table. "Sit, eat, and then you're going to bed, and you're going to sleep for at least 8 hours straight." "But the wheat will still be there in the morning, and you'll be able to work twice as hard if you're actually rested." He set a plate in front of her, bread and cheese and some of the preserves from her mother's stores. Simple food, but her stomach growled at the sight of it. "Eat, Evelyn. That's not a request." She was too tired to fight him, so she ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. Jack sat across from her eating his own meal, and she found herself watching him through heavy-lidded eyes. Even exhausted and muddy and worn down by days of relentless labor, he was handsome in a rough-hewn way that made her pulse quicken. Strong jaw, broad shoulders, those eyes that could be hard as stone or soft as morning mist depending on his mood. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked, catching her staring. "That I'm glad you're here. That I don't know how I'd have survived any of this without you." The words came out before she could stop them, honest and raw. "And that I'm scared, Jack. Scared of what happens next. Scared of losing everything. Scared of—" She trailed off, not quite brave enough to finish the thought. "Scared of what?" She met his eyes across the table. "Scared of wanting something I might not get to keep." Jack went very still. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached across the table and took her hand. "Evelyn Hart, I told you last night that I'm not going anywhere. I meant it. Whatever happens with this farm, with the harvest, with any of it, I'm staying, if you want me to." "Why?" The question burst out of her. "Why would you tie yourself to someone who might lose everything? You could go to Oregon like you planned, start fresh somewhere without all this mess, because Oregon doesn't have you." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "And I've spent enough years running away from things, Evelyn. Maybe it's time I started running towards something instead, towards someone." Tears pricked at her eyes again. God, when had she become such a watering pot? And she blinked them back fiercely. "You barely know me. I know you're strong. I know you're loyal. I know you keep your promises even when they're killing you. I know you work harder than any two men I've ever met, and you do it in skirts that have to make everything 10 times harder." A smile tugged at his mouth. "I know you snore a little when you're really tired, and you talk in your sleep sometimes, and you get this fierce look on your face when you're determined about something that makes me want to help you take on the whole damn world." "I don't snore," Evelyn protested weakly. "You do. It's adorable." "Nothing about me is adorable right now. I'm a mess." Jack stood up and came around the table, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. She went without resistance, too tired to maintain any pretense of independence, and let herself lean against his solid warmth. "You're beautiful," he said against her hair. "Fierce and strong and beautiful. And I thank God, or fate, or whatever brought me to your fence line that day. Because finding you, Evelyn, that's the best thing that's happened to me in more years than I can count." She tilted her face up to his, and he kissed her, soft and gentle this time. Not the desperate passion of the barn, but something deeper and more terrifying. A promise in the touch of his lips, a commitment in the way his hand cradled her face like she was something precious and worth protecting. When they broke apart, Evelyn rested her forehead against his chest and whispered, "I'm falling in love with you, Jack Harlow, and it terrifies me." She felt his sharp intake of breath, felt his arms tighten around her. Good, he said roughly, because I'm already there, and it's lonely falling alone. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the kitchen, while the lamp burned low and the night sounds of the prairie drifted through the open window. Finally, Jack pulled back just enough to look at her. Bed, he said firmly, before you fall asleep standing up. Will you? Evelyn hesitated, felt her cheeks heat. Will you stay? Just until I fall asleep? I don't want to be alone right now. Something soft and painful crossed Jack's face. Of course. Come on. He walked her upstairs to her bedroom, the room that had been hers since childhood, with its faded wallpaper and the quilt her mother had made, and the window that looked out over the wheat fields. Jack helped her sit on the bed, then knelt to unlace her muddy boots with hands that were gentle despite their calluses. I can do that, Evelyn protested. I know you can. Let me, anyway. He set her boots aside, then handed her the nightgown that hung on the hook by the door. I'll wait outside while you change. Jack? He turned at the door. Thank you for everything. Nothing to thank me for. Get changed and into bed. I'll be right outside. Evelyn changed quickly, too tired for modesty or second thoughts, and climbed under the covers. The sheets were cool against her overheated skin, and she felt her body begin to relax for the first time in days. Decent, she called softly. Jack came back in and settled into the old wooden chair by the window, the same chair her father used to sit in when she was sick as a child. The sight of him there, keeping vigil in the gathering dark, made something in Evelyn's chest ache with longing and fear and hope all tangled together. Tell me a story, she said drowsily, her eyes already drifting closed. Tell me about the ocean. Jack was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and soothing, the words washing over her like waves. I only saw it once, years ago, when I was young and stupid and thought I could make my fortune in California. Spent 3 days in San Francisco before I ran out of money and had to head inland looking for work. But those 3 days, Evelyn, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. Water as far as you could see, stretching all the way to the horizon and beyond. And the sound of it, not like a river or a creek, but this constant roar, like the earth itself was breathing. Were you afraid? Evelyn murmured, half asleep already. Terrified, but also free, like I could walk into that water and let it carry me anywhere, become some anyone, start fresh where nobody knew who I was or where I'd come from. Is that what you want, to start fresh? Used to be. Not anymore. She heard him shift in the chair, heard the floorboards creak as he moved closer to the bed. Now I want to build something real, put down roots, make a life that matters. With me? If you'll have me. Yes, with you. Evelyn wanted to respond, wanted to tell him, yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes, but sleep was pulling her down like gentle hands, and the words wouldn't come. The last thing she was aware of was the feel of Jack's rough fingers brushing hair back from her face, and his voice, barely a whisper. Sleep now, Evelyn. I've got you. I'll always have you. And she believed him. When Evelyn woke, gray dawn light was filtering through the curtains, and Jack was gone from the chair. For a moment, panic seized her. Had he left? Decided this was all too much? Gone back to the drifting life he'd known before? But then she heard sounds from downstairs. The clatter of the stove being fired, the pump squeaking, familiar morning noises that spoke of someone comfortable in her kitchen. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Jack making coffee, his hair still damp from washing at the pump. He looked up when she entered and smiled, that devastating smile that made her heart skip. Morning. There's oatmeal on the stove and fresh bread from yesterday. Thought I'd let you sleep as long as possible. What time is it? About 6. You slept for 10 hours straight. He poured coffee into 2 cups, handed her one. Feel better? Evelyn took stock of herself and was surprised to realize she did feel better. Still sore, still exhausted, but no longer on the knife's edge of total collapse. Yes, thank you. Don't thank me for letting you take care of yourself. Jack leaned against the counter, watching her over his coffee cup. Though I'll admit I was starting to worry, you didn't even wake up when I checked on you during the night. You checked on me. Twice. Made sure you were still breathing and not working yourself into a fever. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Old habit from the trail. Always check on your people. Your people. The casual possessiveness of it made Evelyn's stomach flutter. Is that what I am? Your people? Jack set down his coffee cup and crossed to her, taking her face in both hands. Evelyn Hart, you're my person, singular and specific. And if we get through this harvest in one piece, if we save this farm and pay off that banknote and prove that bastard Blackwood wrong, then I'm going to ask you a question that's going to require a very specific answer. Her breath caught. What question? Not yet. Ask me after the wheat's sold and the bank's paid and we know we're going to make it. But soon. He pressed a quick, fierce kiss to her lips. Now eat your breakfast. We've got a lot of work ahead of us still. They fell back into the rhythm of salvage work, but something had shifted between them. Before, they'd been allies united by necessity and circumstance. Now they were partners in something deeper, something that transcended wheat and debts and promises to the dead. Evelyn found herself stealing glances at Jack as they worked, found herself thinking about what question he might ask and what answer she'd give. Because she already knew the answer. Had known it, she realized, since that night in the barn when the storm raged outside and he'd held her while she cried. Maybe even before that, since the first time he'd looked at her like she was someone worth seeing instead of just another desperate farmer's daughter. They were restacking a particularly difficult bundle when they heard riders approaching, several of them, from the sound of it. Evelyn straightened, shading her eyes, and felt surprise ripple through her. It was the Johnsons, all of them. Mr. Johnson on his bay gelding, Mrs. Johnson in the wagon with the 3 oldest children and the younger ones piled in the back. Behind them came the Martins in their own wagon and old Mr. Peterson from town on his mule. Evelyn Hart, Mrs. Johnson called as they pulled up to the fence. Don't just stand there gawking. We've come to help. Evelyn felt her throat close up. Mrs. Johnson, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. We're offering. Heard about the storm damage, and we figured you could use some extra hands. Mrs. Johnson climbed down from the wagon with surprising agility for her size. Lord knows you helped us often enough when Mr. Johnson's back was bad. Time to return the favor. We don't have much time before our own harvest needs tending, Mr. Johnson added, dismounting. But we can give you 2 days. Should be enough to get most of this sorted, with all of us working together. Evelyn looked at Jack, who was grinning widely, then back at the neighbors who'd come to save her. I don't know what to say. Say thank you and put us to work, Mr. Peterson said gruffly. Some of us aren't getting any younger standing around talking. So they worked together, all of them, and what had seemed impossible with just 2 people became merely difficult with 10. The Johnsons' older boys proved surprisingly strong despite their youth, and even the younger children helped by gathering scattered stalks and sorting grain. Mrs. Martin, who'd been silent and stern at the funeral, turned out to have a wicked sense of humor that kept everyone laughing despite the hard work. By evening of the first day, they'd made more progress than Evelyn had dared hope. By the end of the second day, the salvage work was essentially complete. Everything that could be saved was stacked and drying properly. Everything too damaged was cleared away, and the fields looked almost normal again. As the neighbors prepared to leave, Mrs. Johnson pulled Evelyn aside. That man of yours, she said, gesturing to where Jack was helping Mr. Johnson load empty crates into the wagon. He's a good one. Don't let him get away. Evelyn felt her cheeks heat. We're not. Oh, honey, Mrs. Johnson patted her hand with a knowing smile. I've been married for 23 years. I know what I'm seeing, and what I'm seeing is a man who looks at you like you hung the moon, and a woman who looks at him the same way. Don't waste time pretending otherwise. Life's too short and too hard to turn down happiness when it comes knocking. After everyone had left, Evelyn and Jack stood together in the gathering twilight, looking at the fruits of their combined labor. The fields looked battered but survivable, the wheat salvageable, the farm still standing. We're going to make it, Evelyn said softly, and for the first time she truly believed it. Never doubted it, Jack replied, pulling her against his side. Well, maybe doubted it a little. But we're Hart Harlow stubborn. Hart Harlow? Evelyn looked up at him questioningly. Jack's ears went red. I just meant I was thinking about the farm, about the future, and I thought Hart Harlow had a nice ring to it, as a name, for the place. Is that so? Evelyn couldn't keep the smile from her voice. And when exactly did this become the Hart Harlow farm? It hasn't yet, but maybe... He turned to face her fully, and there was vulnerability in his eyes that made her breath catch. Maybe someday soon, if you wanted? Evelyn stood on her toes and kissed him soundly. Ask me after the wheat sold and the banks paid. Wasn't that what you said? That was before your neighbors showed up and saved our asses and made me realize that good things can happen even when you're not expecting them. Jack pulled her closer. That was before I stood here watching you work alongside people who care about you and realized I want to be part of that. Part of this community, this life, this family you've built here. You already are part of it, Evelyn said fiercely. The moment you offered to work for a promise instead of wages, you became part of this place, part of me. They kissed again, longer this time, until the sky had gone from purple to indigo and the first stars were appearing overhead. When they finally broke apart, Jack rested his forehead against hers. Let's finish this thing, he said. Let's harvest this wheat, sell it for top dollar, pay off that banknote, and build a life that would make your father proud. Together. Together, Evelyn agreed. And in that single word was a promise bigger than the one she'd made to her dying father. A promise to herself, to Jack, to the future they were building one hard-won day at a time. The wheat was nearly ready for threshing now, and with it would come the final test, whether they'd saved enough, whether the quality was high enough, whether they could sell it for enough to clear the debt and keep the farm. But for tonight, standing in the twilight with Jack's arms around her and the fields stretching golden in every direction, Evelyn let herself simply be grateful. Grateful for neighbors who showed up when needed. Grateful for a man who'd ridden into her life at its darkest moment and stayed through storm and struggle. Grateful for her own stubborn strength that had refused to break even when breaking would have been easier. Tomorrow would bring threshing and bargaining and the hard mathematics of profit and debt. But tonight, there was only this: the warm weight of Jack's embrace, the soft wind through the wheat, and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. The threshing began 3 days later, when the wheat had dried enough to separate grain from chaff without risking mold or spoilage. Jack had arranged to borrow the Johnsons' threshing machine, a temperamental beast of wood and metal that required constant attention and occasional cursing to keep running. And together they set about the backbreaking work of processing 40 acres worth of grain. Evelyn had thought the harvest itself was hard. She'd been wrong. Threshing was a different kind of torture, repetitive, dusty, and unforgiving. They fed bundle after bundle into the machine's hungry maw, and it spit out grain on one side and straw on the other, all while making a noise like the devil's own drum corps. The dust got everywhere, in her eyes, her nose, her throat, coating her clothes and skin until she felt like she was made of wheat chaff herself. But slowly, impossibly, the pile of processed grain began to grow. They filled one burlap sack, then another, then another. Jack had rigged a makeshift scale using stones and a plank, and he weighed each sack carefully, making notes in the little book he kept in his shirt pocket. Evelyn watched him work with a mixture of affection and curiosity. There was something almost tender in the way he handled the grain, like he understood how much it meant to her. "How's it looking?" she asked during a brief break, her voice hoarse from the dust. Jack consulted his notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Better than I expected, actually. If the rest processes out at this rate, we're looking at maybe 300 bushels. Could be more." Evelyn's heart leaped. 300? Jack, at current market rates, that's enough to clear your father's debt with the bank and then some. Maybe even enough to put some aside for next year's seed and repairs. He looked up at her, a slow smile spreading across his dust-covered face. "Evelyn, I think we did it. I think we actually saved this place." She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself feel the relief and joy his words promised. But years of struggle and disappointment had taught her caution. We still need to get it to market, still need to negotiate a fair price, and we need to make sure Blackwood doesn't somehow interfere. "Always expecting the worst," Jack said, but there was affection in his tone. "That's what I love about you. You're realistic." The casual way he said love made Evelyn's breath catch, but before she could respond, the threshing machine made an alarming grinding noise and shuddered to a halt. "Damn it," Jack muttered, already moving to investigate. Not again. They spent the next hour coaxing the machine back to life, and by the time they had it running again, the moment for discussing love and futures had passed. But the word hung between them anyway, a promise and a question all wrapped into one. The threshing took 5 grueling days. 5 days of dawn to dusk labor, of dust and noise, and the constant anxiety that the machine would break down beyond repair. 5 days of Jack's steady presence beside her, his quiet competence and occasional terrible jokes that somehow made the work bearable. 5 days of falling into bed so exhausted she couldn't even dream, only to wake before dawn and start all over again. But at the end of those 5 days, they had 327 bushels of wheat, clean, dry, and ready for market. Evelyn stood in the barn, looking at the neat rows of filled sacks, and felt tears sting her eyes. "We did it, Papa," she whispered to the empty air. "I kept my promise." Jack found her there an hour later, still standing among the grain sacks like she was afraid they'd disappear if she looked away. He didn't say anything, just wrapped his arms around her from behind and held her while she cried quiet tears of relief and exhaustion and grief that her father wasn't here to see this moment. "He knows," Jack said softly against her hair. "Wherever he is, Thomas Hart knows you kept your word, and he's proud as hell of you. I couldn't have done it without you." "Maybe, but you'd have found a way. That's who you are. Someone who finds a way." He turned her in his arms so she was facing him. "Now comes the hard part. Selling this wheat for what it's actually worth, not what some slick buyer wants to pay for it." Evelyn nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was thinking we should go to Helena. The buyers there pay better than the local mill, and we've got quantity on our side. 300 bushels is enough to negotiate with. Helena's 3 days' travel with a loaded wagon. That's a week-round trip, minimum." Jack's expression was thoughtful. "But you're right. We'll get a better price there. Question is, can we both afford to be gone that long? Someone needs to stay here and watch the place. Blackwood strikes me as the type who'd try something if he knew the farm was empty." The thought of being separated from Jack for a week made Evelyn's chest ache in a way that would have seemed ridiculous just a month ago. But she forced herself to think practically. "You're right. One of us should stay, and it should be you." "Like hell," Jack said immediately. "You're not going to Helena alone with a wagon full of wheat and no one watching your back. Too many things could go wrong. I've made the trip before. I know the route, know the buyers. And you are a young woman traveling alone with valuable cargo. Evelyn, I'm not trying to coddle you, but that's a risk I'm not willing to take." His jaw was set in that stubborn way she was beginning to recognize. "I'll go. You stay here." "But the buyers know me. They knew my father. They'll try to cheat you." "Then come with me. We'll ask the Johnsons to keep an eye on the place while we're gone." Evelyn chewed her lip, torn between caution and desire. The thought of a week on the road with Jack, just the two of them, away from the farm and its constant demands, was more tempting than she wanted to admit. But leaving the farm felt wrong, like abandoning her post. "We could compromise," Jack suggested, seeing her hesitation. "Take 4 days instead of 7. Push hard, don't dawdle. Make the deals and get back. And we ask Mr. Johnson to check the property every day we're gone. His farm's close enough he could ride over morning and evening." It was a reasonable plan, which didn't make Evelyn like it anymore. But Jack was right about one thing. She didn't want to make this trip alone. And she didn't want him going without her either, where she couldn't see what deals he was making or what promises he was giving. "All right," she said finally. "We'll both go, but we leave at first light tomorrow. The sooner we get there, the sooner we're back." Jack's smile was relieved and warm. "Deal. I'll go talk to Mr. Johnson now, make sure he's willing to play watchdog. You start figuring out what we need to pack." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. Evelyn packed food that would travel well: hard bread, dried meat, cheese wrapped in cloth. Jack checked over the wagon, replacing a worn wheel and greasing the axles, making sure everything was in good repair for the hard travel ahead. They loaded the grain sacks carefully, distributing the weight evenly, then covered everything with canvas tarps secured with rope. By evening, they were as ready as they'd ever be. Mr. Johnson had agreed to check the property twice daily and promised to run off anyone who came sniffing around. Mrs. Johnson had insisted on providing extra food and a jug of what she called medicinal brandy for emergencies, though the twinkle in her eye suggested she had a broader definition of emergency than most. That night, over a simple supper, Jack and Evelyn went over the plan one more time. They'd leave before dawn, travel hard to make the first way station by dark. Then 2 more days of travel to reach Helena, a day to find buyers and negotiate prices, and 3 days back with whatever money they could get. What if the prices have dropped? Evelyn asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. What if there's been a glut in the market and they're only offering half what we need? Then we negotiate harder, or we store the wheat and wait for prices to come back up. Jack reached across the table and took her hand. Evelyn, we've come this far. We're not going to fail at the finish line. But if we do, we won't. His grip tightened. But even if we did, even if the worst happened, and we lost this place despite everything, we'd still have each other. We'd start over somewhere else and build something new, together. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. This farm is all I have, all I know. No, it's not. You have me. You have neighbors who came running when you needed help. You have skills and strength and more courage than anyone I've ever met. The farm is important, but it's not all you are, Evelyn Hart. He stood up and came around the table, pulling her to her feet. And if the absolute worst happens, if we lose everything despite our best efforts, we'll survive it. Because we're survivors, both of us. We've already proven that. She leaned into him, letting his solid strength anchor her against the storm of anxiety in her chest. When did you get so wise? About 3 years ago, when I lost everything and realized I was still breathing. Funny how rock bottom teaches you what really matters. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Now come on. Early start tomorrow means early to bed tonight. They went upstairs together, and at the door to her room, Evelyn hesitated. The proper thing would be to say goodnight here, to maintain the fiction that they were just business partners, nothing more. But propriety felt ridiculous after everything they'd been through together. Stay, she said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. I just don't want to be alone tonight. Don't want to lie there worrying about everything that could go wrong tomorrow. Jack's hand came up to cup her cheek, tilting her face up until she was looking at him. You sure? Because Evelyn, if I stay in that room with you, even just to sleep, there's going to be talk when we get back. People will assume things. Let them assume. I don't care anymore. And she realized it was true. She didn't care what people thought, didn't care about propriety or reputation or anything except the fact that she wanted Jack beside her through the long, anxious night ahead. So he stayed, and they lay together in her narrow childhood bed, fully clothed and careful, his arms wrapped around her and her head on his chest. They talked in whispers about small things, favorite foods, childhood memories, dreams they'd had and lost, and maybe could dream again. Jack told her about a dog he'd had as a boy, a mongrel mutt named Rusty who'd been his best friend for 12 years. Evelyn told him about learning to ride on her father's old mare, how terrified and exhilarated she'd been the first time the horse actually listened to her commands. If we make enough from the wheat, Jack said drowsily, maybe we should get some horses. Good stock, not just work animals. Start breeding them. See if we can add that to the farm's income. Evelyn smiled in the darkness. You're already planning investments. Well, yeah, assuming you want me to stick around after we get back from Helena. There was uncertainty in his voice despite his casual tone. Assuming you want me here at all. She shifted so she could look at him, even though it was too dark to see much more than the outline of his face. Jack Harlow, you're the only thing I'm more certain about than this farm. Of course I want you here. I want you here tomorrow and next month and next year and all the years after that, if you're willing. She felt his sharp intake of breath, felt his arms tighten around her. That's good, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Because I was thinking, after we sell the wheat, after we pay off the bank, maybe we should make this arrangement official, legal. Evelyn's heart started hammering. What kind of arrangement? The kind where I get to call you my wife, and you get to call me your husband, and we spend the rest of our lives arguing about whether to plant wheat or try corn, and how many horses we can afford, and what to name all the children we're going to have. Children? Evelyn's voice came out as a squeak. Well, yeah, eventually, if you want them. I know we haven't really talked about that, but I always figured, I'd like... Jack trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Unless you don't want children? Because that's fine too, I just assumed. Evelyn kissed him to shut him up, and felt his surprise give way to enthusiasm as he kissed her back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she said firmly, yes. Yes to children? Yes to all of it. The legal arrangement, the husband and wife thing, the arguing about crops, the children someday when we're ready. Yes to building a life with you. Yes to Hart Harlow Farm. She kissed him again, quick and fierce. Yes, Jack, to everything. She felt him smile against her lips. Well, that was easier than I expected. Here I had this whole speech planned about how I know I don't have much to offer except strong hands and a stubborn streak, but you jumped right to yes. Did you want me to make you give the speech? God, no, I'm terrible at speeches. This is much better. He gathered her close again, and Evelyn felt him relax in a way she'd never seen before, like some essential tension had finally released. We should probably sleep. Long day tomorrow. Probably, Evelyn agreed, but neither of them moved. They just lay there, wrapped around each other, and Evelyn thought that this quiet intimacy, this simple joy of being close to someone who loved her, might be worth more than all the wheat in Montana. Eventually, exhaustion claimed them both, and they slept deeply and dreamlessly, tangled together like they'd been doing this for years instead of for the first time. When dawn came, gray and cool, they woke together and prepared for the journey ahead. Jack hitched the horses while Evelyn did a final check of the supplies, making sure they had everything they needed. By the time the sun crested the horizon, they were on the road, the loaded wagon creaking beneath them and the farm receding in the distance behind them. The first day of travel was long but uneventful. They made good time despite the heavy load, and the weather stayed clear and cooperative. Jack drove while Evelyn sat beside him, occasionally reading aloud from the book of poetry she'd brought, her mother's old volume, the pages soft and worn from years of handling. Listen to this one, she said, flipping through the pages. It's about harvest time. Golden grain beneath the sky, earthbound wealth that none can buy, sweat and toil and honest care, these the treasures farmers share. Your mother liked poetry? Loved it. She'd recite verses while she worked, said it made the labor feel less endless. Evelyn ran her fingers over the faded cover. My father used to tease her about it, said you couldn't eat pretty words, but I'd catch him sometimes listening to her recite while she thought he wasn't paying attention, and he'd have this look on his face like she'd given him something precious. Sounds like they were happy. They were. Even when times were hard, even when the crops failed or the winter was brutal, they had each other. That seemed to be enough. She glanced at Jack. I never really understood that when I was younger. Thought love was just something that happened in stories. But now I get it. How someone can be your home more than any place. How you'd rather face disaster together than face success alone. She leaned against his shoulder. You've become my home, Jack. Somewhere along the way, without me even noticing it happening. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the road ahead. Then he said softly, that might be the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me. And I don't have any poetry to say back, just that you're my home too, Evelyn. First real home I've had in more years than I can count. They rode in comfortable silence after that, the wagon wheels turning beneath them and the prairie stretching endless on all sides. They passed other travelers occasionally, a family in a covered wagon heading west, a circuit preacher on a tired mule, a group of cowboys driving cattle toward distant markets. Everyone nodded in greeting, and a few stopped to exchange news and warnings about road conditions ahead. They made the first way station just as darkness fell, a rough establishment that was more barn than inn but provided hot food and a place to sleep. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Finnegan, took one look at the loaded wagon and offered to guard it overnight for an extra $1. Lot of unsavory types use this road, he explained, squinting at them with one good eye while the other wandered independently. Wagon like that, full of grain? Might attract the wrong attention. Jack paid the extra $1 without argument, and they settled in for the night in the loft above the stable. It wasn't comfortable, just hay and blankets. But they were together, and after the long day of travel, even the scratchy hay felt like luxury. The second day brought rain, not the violent storms they'd battled during harvest, but steady, miserable drizzle that soaked through their clothes and turned the road into mud. The wagon moved slower, the horses struggling with the added resistance, and by evening they'd fallen behind schedule. "We should stop," Evelyn said, shivering despite the blanket Jack had wrapped around her shoulders. "The horses are exhausted, and if we push too hard in this mud, we risk breaking a wheel." Jack looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded reluctantly and guided the wagon off the road toward a stand of cottonwood trees that provided minimal shelter. They made camp there, eating cold food because the rain made fire impossible, and huddled together under the wagon for warmth. "Some romantic journey this turned out to be," Jack said wryly, trying to adjust his position to avoid a puddle that was forming beneath them. "I promise the actual marriage will be more comfortable." Despite her discomfort, Evelyn laughed. "I don't know. I think this is good practice. Marriage is probably going to involve a lot of uncomfortable situations and making the best of bad weather." "Fair point." He pulled her closer against his side. "At least we're good at making the best of things." They slept fitfully that night, waking often to the sound of rain and the discomfort of their makeshift shelter. But when morning came with clear skies and warming sun, their spirits lifted. The road dried quickly, and they made up for lost time, pushing hard through the afternoon. Helena appeared on the horizon late in the third day, a sprawling mining town that had grown fat on silver strikes and now served as a major trading hub for the region. The streets were crowded with wagons and riders, and the air smelled of smoke and livestock and human industry. Evelyn had been here before, but never with so much riding on the outcome of her visit. They found a respectable boarding house near the edge of town and paid for a room and stable space for the horses. The proprietress, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gunderson, looked them over with suspicious eyes. "You married?" she asked bluntly. "Not yet," Jack said before Evelyn could respond. "But soon. We're here on business, need to sell our wheat crop and get back home to prepare for the wedding." It was a smooth lie, delivered with just the right mix of pride and embarrassment, and Mrs. Gunderson's expression softened slightly. "Well, congratulations then. I'll put you in adjoining rooms, proper and respectable, but you can leave the connecting door unlocked if you want." She said it with a knowing look that suggested she'd been young once too. After they'd settled in and washed off the worst of the travel grime, Evelyn and Jack walked into town to scout out potential buyers. The grain exchange was a chaotic place. Dozens of farmers and buyers shouting prices and quantities, samples being examined and rejected, money changing hands in rapid negotiations. Evelyn felt her confidence waver as she watched men who'd been doing this their whole lives haggle with practiced ease. "We'll do this together," Jack murmured, reading her hesitation. "You know the quality of our grain. I know how to negotiate. Between us, we'll get a fair price." They approached several buyers that evening, offering samples from their load and listening to initial offers. The prices ranged from insulting to merely inadequate, and by the time they returned to the boarding house, Evelyn was fighting despair. "They're trying to cheat us," she said as they climbed the stairs to their rooms, "offering half what the grain's worth because they think we're desperate. Then tomorrow we show them we're not desperate. We show them we're willing to walk away." Jack opened the door to her room and followed her inside, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking, what if we approach the big mills directly, skip the middleman buyers entirely? We've got quantity and quality. That's what the mills want. They might pay more to deal direct." It was a risky strategy, but Evelyn was tired of being underestimated. "Let's try it. What do we have to lose?" The next morning, they dressed in their best clothes. Jack in his only suit, worn but well-maintained, and Evelyn in the dress her mother had made for special occasions, dark blue with buttons that still shone, and approached the largest mill in Helena. The foreman was skeptical at first, but when Jack insisted he examine their grain samples, his attitude changed. "This is good wheat," he admitted, running the grain through his fingers with practiced assessment. "Storm damage minimal, moisture content perfect. Where'd you say this came from?" "Hart Farm, about 3 days west," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. 327 bushels, all this quality or better." The foreman quoted a price that made Evelyn's knees weak. Not as much as pre-storm prices would have been, but significantly more than any of the exchange buyers had offered. It was enough. More than enough. Enough to pay off the banknote with money left over for seed and repairs and maybe even some small luxuries. But Jack shook his head. That's a fair offer for standard grain, but this isn't standard. This is premium quality, and you know it. We want 10% more. The foreman's eyes narrowed. That's premium pricing. I'd need to see the full load before I agree to that. Then come see it, Jack said calmly. It's all sitting in Mrs. Gunderson's stable waiting for the right buyer. You examine every sack if you want. I guarantee you won't find fault with it. They spent the next hour at the stable, the foreman methodically checking samples from different sacks, testing moisture content, looking for signs of rot or contamination. Finally, he straightened and nodded. All right, premium pricing, but I want the full load delivered to the mill by tomorrow afternoon. Can you manage that? Yes, sir, Evelyn said quickly, before he could change his mind. We'll have it there first thing in the morning. They shook hands on the deal, and the foreman left to draw up the paperwork. As soon as he was out of sight, Evelyn grabbed Jack and kissed him fiercely, not caring who saw. We did it, she breathed against his lips. Jack, we actually did it. You did it, he corrected, grinning widely. That was all you, standing there looking like you'd walk away if you didn't meet your terms. I just backed your play. They spent the rest of the day in a daze of relief and joy, wandering the streets of Helena like tourists instead of desperate farmers. Jack bought her a new ribbon for her hair from a street vendor, and she insisted on buying him a proper hat to replace the battered one he'd been wearing. They ate at a real restaurant. Nothing fancy, just stew and bread, but served on actual plates by a waitress who called them sir and ma'am. And for a few hours, they let themselves feel like people instead of just survivors. That night, back at the boarding house, they left the connecting door between their rooms open and talked long into the darkness. They talked about the farm, about plans for next year, about maybe trying corn in the north field where drainage was better. They talked about marriage and what kind of wedding they'd have. Something simple, Evelyn thought, just the preacher and a few witnesses, nothing fancy or expensive. They talked about children, about how many they might want and what they'd name them. If it's a boy, we should name him Thomas, Evelyn said softly. After my father. And if it's a girl? Sarah, maybe? After my mother, or... She paused, feeling suddenly shy. What was your mother's name? Catherine. Jack's voice was rough with emotion. Katie, everyone called her. She died when I was 10, but I remember she used to sing, had the prettiest voice you ever heard. Then Catherine, if it's a girl, Kate for short. Evelyn smiled in the darkness. Thomas and Kate Harlow, future heirs to the Hart Harlow farm. Getting a little ahead of ourselves, aren't we? We're not even married yet. Details, Evelyn said airily, and heard Jack's laugh rumble through the wall between their rooms. They delivered the wheat to the mill the next morning, and by noon they were walking away with a bank draft large enough to make Evelyn's hands shake as she held it. It was real. It was actually real. They'd saved the farm. They spent one more night in Helena, this time sleeping deeply and peacefully, the anxiety that had been driving them for weeks finally released. And the next morning, they began the journey home with an empty wagon and full hearts, ready to face whatever came next. Together. The journey home felt different than the journey out. The wagon was lighter without its cargo of wheat, and so were their hearts. They made better time despite taking a more leisurely pace, stopping to rest the horses whenever they felt like it, talking and laughing in ways they hadn't allowed themselves before. The bank draft sat safe in Evelyn's pocket, folded carefully inside a leather pouch, and every time she touched it to make sure it was still there, she felt a rush of relief so intense it was almost painful. They were 2 days out from home when they stopped at a small creek to water the horses and eat the lunch Mrs. Gunderson had packed for them. The day was warm and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made everything feel possible. Jack spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree while Evelyn unpacked their food, and they settled in to eat with the easy comfort of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. I've been thinking, Jack said, tearing off a piece of bread and handing half to Evelyn, about what we do when we get back. First thing is obviously the bank. Pay off that note before they can even think about foreclosure. But after that, Evelyn prompted, taking a bite of cheese. After that, I think we should get married. Soon. Like next week soon. He said it casually, but there was tension in his shoulders that suggested the answer mattered more than he was letting on. Evelyn felt warmth spread through her chest. That fast? Don't you want time to plan, to make it proper? I've spent enough of my life waiting for the right time, the right circumstances, the perfect moment. And you know what I learned? The perfect moment is the one you're living in right now. He turned to face her fully. I love you, Evelyn Hart. I want to marry you and build a life with you and wake up every morning knowing you're mine and I'm yours. Why wait when we both know what we want? I love you too, Evelyn said softly, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. And you're right. Why wait? Let's do it. Let's pay off the bank and get married and start our life together properly. Jack's smile was brilliant and young, transforming his weathered face into something almost boyish. Yeah? Yeah. She leaned over and kissed him, tasting bread and sunshine and promise. Though I should warn you, I don't have anything fancy to wear. No white dress or veil or any of that. Don't care. You could wear a flour sack and you'd still be the most beautiful bride in Montana. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. All I care about is you saying yes in front of witnesses and a preacher, making this legal and binding so you can't change your mind and throw me off your farm. Evelyn laughed against his chest. Our farm. It's going to be our farm, remember? Hart Harlow. Our farm, Jack repeated like he was testing the words. I like the sound of that. They stayed by the creek longer than they probably should have, stealing kisses and making plans and generally acting like the lovesick fools they'd become. But eventually the angle of the sun reminded them they had miles to cover before dark, and they reluctantly packed up and continued their journey. They made it home on the fourth day, arriving just as the sun was setting and painting everything gold. Mr. Johnson was just leaving after his evening check of the property, and he greeted them with obvious relief. Thank God you're back safe, he said, riding over to meet them. Had a bit of excitement while you were gone. That Blackwood fellow showed up 2 days ago, nosing around, asking questions about where you'd gone and when you'd be back. I told him it was none of his damn business, and to get off Hart property before I ran him off with my rifle. Evelyn felt anger spike through her exhaustion. He came here? To my land? Didn't get far. I was watching, like I promised. Sent him packing with his tail between his legs. Mr. Johnson's expression was grim. But I'd watch yourself with that one, Evelyn. He's up to something. I'd bet my last dollar on it. After Mr. Johnson left, Evelyn and Jack unhitched the wagon and tended the horses in heavy silence. The joy of their return had been tainted by the reminder that they still had enemies, still had challenges to face. Tomorrow, Jack said firmly as they walked toward the house. Tomorrow we go to town, pay off that bank note, and make sure Blackwood can't touch this place legally. Then we deal with everything else. But tomorrow came with its own surprises. They rode into town early, both dressed in their best clothes, the bank draft secure in Jack's pocket this time. The bank was a squat brick building on Main Street, imposing and solid, and Evelyn felt her stomach clench as they walked through the doors. The bank manager, a portly man named Clemens, who'd been friendly enough when her father was alive but distant since his death, looked up from his desk with surprise when he saw them. Miss Hart, I wasn't expecting to see you today. His tone suggested he'd been hoping not to see her at all. Mr. Clemens. Evelyn kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. I've come to settle my father's account, the note he took out for last year's seed and equipment. Clemens' expression shifted to something uncomfortable. Ah, yes. About that note, Miss Hart. I'm afraid there's been a development. Evelyn felt Jack tense beside her. What kind of development? The note was sold 2 days ago. I no longer hold the debt. Clemens shuffled papers on his desk, not quite meeting their eyes. It's perfectly legal, mind you. The bank has the right to sell debts to other parties if we choose to do so. Sold to who? Evelyn demanded, though she already knew the answer with sick certainty. Mr. Henry Blackwood purchased the note at full value. The debt is now owed to him rather than to the bank. Clemens finally looked up, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. I'm sorry, Miss Hart. It was a business decision. Mr. Blackwood made a very generous offer, and the bank board voted to accept it. Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her. This was worse than foreclosure. At least with the bank, there were laws, procedures, set timelines. But a private debt held by a man like Blackwood? He could call it due whenever he wanted, could add fees and interest, could make her life a living hell until she had no choice but to sell. "When is the note due?" Jack asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Originally it was due in 4 weeks, but as the new holder of the debt, Mr. Blackwood has the right to modify the terms. I believe he's planning to contact Miss Hart directly about that." Clemens stood, clearly eager to end this uncomfortable conversation. "Again, I'm sorry. If there's nothing else—" They left the bank in stunned silence. Outside, Evelyn leaned against the hitching post, trying to catch her breath, trying to think through the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. "He did this on purpose," she said finally. "He knew we went to Helena to sell the wheat. Mr. Johnson must have let something slip, or someone saw us loading the wagon. Blackwood knew we'd have the money to pay off the debt, so he bought it out from under us to make sure we still owe him." "Then we pay him," Jack said firmly. "We have the money. We go to his ranch right now and settle the debt before he can play any more games. What if he won't accept payment? What if he's planning to hold this over us, use it to force us to sell?" "Then we make him accept payment, with witnesses, with paperwork, all legal and proper so he can't claim otherwise." Jack took her hand. "Evelyn, we didn't come this far to let some cattle baron steal what we fought for. We're going to Blackwood's ranch, we're paying off this debt, and we're making damn sure he understands that Hart land isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." The Blackwood Ranch was everything the Hart farm wasn't: sprawling, prosperous, with buildings that looked new and expensive rather than weathered by generations of use. They rode up the long drive with their heads held high, refusing to be intimidated by the obvious display of wealth. A ranch hand directed them to the main house, where Blackwood himself answered the door. He was dressed casually, like a man relaxing in his own home, but his smile when he saw them was sharp and predatory. "Miss Hart, Mr. Harlow, what a pleasant surprise. Please come in." He stepped back, gesturing them inside. "We'll stand out here, thank you," Evelyn said coldly. "This won't take long. I understand you purchased my father's banknote." "I did indeed. A sound investment, I thought." Blackwood leaned against the doorframe, completely at ease. "The bank was eager to liquidate the debt, and I was happy to help. I'm here to settle that debt. Full payment, right now." Evelyn nodded to Jack, who pulled out the bank draft. "This should more than cover the principal and any accrued interest." Blackwood barely glanced at the draft. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Miss Hart. You see, when I purchased the note, I also acquired the right to modify its terms, and I've decided to exercise that right." "What terms?" Jack asked, his voice flat. "Well, for one thing, I'm calling the note due immediately. Today. Right now, in fact." Blackwood's smile widened. "And I'm adding a 20% administrative fee for the transfer of the debt, plus interest calculated at the new rate I've set, which is considerably higher than what the bank was charging." Evelyn felt rage burn through her shock. "That's not legal. You can't just—" "Actually, I can. The contract your father signed gave the debt holder broad discretion to set terms. It's all perfectly legal, Miss Hart. I checked with my lawyers." He gestured at the bank draft Jack was still holding. "That draft you're holding, it might have covered the original debt, but with my fees and interest, you're now short by, probably $300 or so." $300. It might as well have been $3,000. They didn't have it. Everything they'd made from the wheat sale was in that single bank draft. And even if they cashed it and paid Blackwood, they'd have nothing left. No money for seed, no cushion for emergencies, no way to survive the winter. "You're trying to steal my farm," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with fury. "This whole thing was planned from the start. You waited until my father died, bought his debt, and now you're trying to force me out with fees I can't possibly pay." "I'm a businessman, Miss Hart. I see opportunities and I take them. Your father's death was unfortunate, but it created a situation where this land became available." Blackwood straightened, his expression hardening. "Here's what's going to happen. You can't pay the full amount I'm owed, which means you're in default. That gives me the legal right to foreclose. Or you can sell me the land at a price I deem fair, settle the debt that way, and walk away with a little money in your pocket. Your choice." Go to hell, Jack said flatly. We're not selling. Then I'll see you in foreclosure court. I'm sure the judge will be very sympathetic to a young woman who can't pay her debts. Blackwood's smile was cruel. You have 48 hours to make your decision, Miss Hart. After that, I file foreclosure papers, and this all becomes a matter of public record. I'd hate for your neighbors to see you lose your family farm because you were too proud to accept a reasonable offer. He went back inside and shut the door, leaving them standing on his porch, fury and helplessness warring in Evelyn's chest. The ride home was silent and grim. Evelyn kept turning the problem over in her mind, looking for solutions, for loopholes, for any way out of the trap Blackwood had set. But every path she examined led to the same conclusion. They were going to lose the farm. There has to be something we can do, she said finally, her voice cracking. Some legal recourse, some way to fight this. We could try to borrow the extra money, Jack suggested, but his tone was doubtful. Maybe the Johnsons or some of the other neighbors, they don't have that kind of money to lend. None of them do. We're all farmers barely scraping by. Evelyn blinked back tears of frustration. I kept my promise to my father. I saved the wheat. I sold it for a fair price. I did everything right. And it still wasn't enough. They made it home as darkness fell, both exhausted and heartsick. Evelyn went through the motions of preparing supper while Jack tended the horses, but neither of them had any appetite when they sat down to eat. They just pushed food around their plates and tried not to look at each other, tried not to acknowledge that everything they'd fought for was slipping through their fingers. I won't marry you, Evelyn said abruptly, the words tearing out of her. I won't tie you to a failure, Jack. You should go to Oregon like you planned. Start fresh somewhere without all this mess. Jack's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare. Don't you dare try to push me away because things got hard. But you deserve better than... I deserve you, and you deserve me, and we deserve this farm and the life we were planning. He stood up, came around the table, and pulled her to her feet. Evelyn Hart, I told you I'm not going anywhere, and I meant it. We'll figure this out together. How? We're out of options. Maybe not all of them. Jack's expression was thoughtful. Blackwood said we have 48 hours. That's enough time to talk to a lawyer, see if those fees and interest he tacked on are actually legal. Enough time to talk to the neighbors, see if anyone knows something about Blackwood that could help us. Enough time to fight. And if fighting doesn't work, then we try something else. We're survivors, remember? We don't give up just because one rich bastard thinks he can bully us. He cupped her face in his hands. Trust me, Evelyn. Please. Give me 48 hours to find a way out of this. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that everything would work out somehow. But hope felt dangerous after so much loss, so much struggle. Still, looking into Jack's storm-gray eyes, seeing the absolute conviction there, she found herself nodding. 48 hours, she agreed. But Jack, if we can't find a way, promise me you'll leave. Promise me you won't go down with this sinking ship. The only promise I'm making is that we're in this together, win or lose. He kissed her fiercely. Now come on, we've got work to do. They stayed up most of the night, going through her father's papers, looking for anything that might help. Old contracts, correspondence with the bank, records of dealings with Blackwood from years past. Evelyn's eyes burned with exhaustion and the strain of reading by lamplight, but she kept going, driven by desperation and Jack's stubborn refusal to give up. It was nearly dawn when Jack made a sound of surprise. Evelyn, look at this. He was holding a letter, yellowed with age, the handwriting shaky but still legible. Evelyn moved closer to read over his shoulder. It was from Blackwood, written 5 years ago, offering to buy the Hart farm at what even then was an insultingly low price. But it wasn't the offer that caught her attention. It was what her father had written in the margins, notes to himself that he'd apparently never followed up on. Check property lines. B's north fence encroaches 6 feet onto Heartland per original survey. Mentioned to B, he got hostile, letting it go for sake of peace, but keeping proof in case needed later. Evelyn's heart started beating faster. 6 feet doesn't sound like much. 6 feet along how much of the property line? Jack was already moving, searching through the papers for the survey her grandfather had done when he first claimed the land. If it's 6 feet along a significant distance, that's a lot of acreage. And if Blackwood knew he was encroaching and didn't do anything about it, they found the old survey map, brittle and faded, but still detailed enough to show the exact boundaries of both properties. And there it was, the north fence line that divided Heartland from Blackwood's ranch, running for nearly half a mile. If that fence was 6 feet over onto Hart property for that entire distance, it added up to almost an acre of land that Blackwood had been illegally using for years. "We need to verify this," Evelyn said, her mind racing. "Get a proper surveyor out here. Make sure the original survey is accurate. If we can prove Blackwood's been encroaching on our land, then we have leverage," Jack finished. "Maybe enough leverage to make him back off on this debt collection scheme." His smile was sharp and satisfied. Blackwood's built his reputation on being a sharp businessman who follows the law. How's it going to look when people find out he's been stealing land from his neighbors? Even if it's just an acre, even if he claims it was an honest mistake, the scandal alone could hurt him. Hope flared in Evelyn's chest, bright and almost painful. "First thing tomorrow, today I mean, we get a surveyor. Mr. Peterson will know someone in town who can do it." They managed a few hours of restless sleep, then rode into town as soon as the general store opened. Mr. Peterson listened to their story with growing outrage, then pointed them toward a surveyor named Thompson who had an office above the feed store. Thompson was an older man with precise hands and an even more precise manner. He listened to their request, examined the old survey map, and nodded thoughtfully. "I can have preliminary results by this afternoon if we start now. Full detailed survey will take longer, but if you just need confirmation of the fence line placement, that's simple enough." He quoted a price that made Evelyn wince. It would eat into their limited cash reserves, but Jack paid it without hesitation. They spent the day following Thompson around the property line, watching him set up his equipment and take measurements, marking positions with stakes and making careful notes. The work was painstakingly slow, and Evelyn felt every passing minute like a weight on her chest. 48 hours was ticking down, and they still didn't know if this gambit would work. By late afternoon, Thompson had his answer. The north fence was indeed on Hart property, not 6 feet as her father had thought, but closer to 8 feet, and running for the entire half-mile length of the shared border. It added up to almost 1¼ acres that Blackwood had been using without right. "It's enough," Jack said grimly, studying Thompson's preliminary map. "It's definitely enough." They rode to Blackwood's ranch for the second time in 2 days, this time with Thompson's report in hand and fire in their eyes. Blackwood answered the door with the same smug expression as before, but it faltered slightly when he saw their faces. "Miss Hart, Mr. Harlow, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Have you decided to accept my generous offer after all?" "Actually, we've come to discuss a different matter," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "It's come to our attention that your north fence line is encroaching on Hart property. Has been for years, apparently." Blackwood's expression went carefully neutral. "I'm sure that's just a misunderstanding. Property lines in this territory can be imprecise." "This isn't imprecise. This is a surveyor's report showing that you've been illegally using 1¼ acres of my land for at least 5 years. Evelyn held up Thompson's document. "Land you've been grazing your cattle on, cutting hay from, treating as your own despite having no legal right to it." "I'm sure if there's been any encroachment, it was an honest mistake. My father told you about it 5 years ago," Evelyn interrupted. "He mentioned it to you, and according to his notes, you got hostile and refused to discuss it." "That doesn't sound like an honest mistake, Mr. Blackwood. That sounds like deliberate theft." Blackwood's face hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Hart. I hope you have proof." "I have my father's written notes documenting the conversation. I have the original survey from when my grandfather first claimed the land, and I have a new survey done today by a licensed surveyor showing the same encroachment." Evelyn took a step closer. "Now here's what's going to happen, Mr. Blackwood. You're going to cancel those bogus fees and interest you tried to tack onto my father's debt. You're going to accept the bank draft we offered yesterday as payment in full. And you're going to move your fence back onto your own property where it belongs. And if I don't, then we go to the territorial land office and file a formal complaint. We go to the newspaper and tell everyone in town that the great Henry Blackwood built his fortune partly by stealing land from a dying farmer. We make sure every person in this valley knows exactly what kind of man you are." Evelyn's voice was cold as winter. "I'm sure that will do wonders for your reputation and your business dealings." Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, and Evelyn could see him calculating, weighing the scandal against the satisfaction of destroying her. Finally, his shoulders dropped slightly in defeat. "You're very much your father's daughter," he said, and there was grudging respect in his tone. "Thomas was a stubborn son of a bitch, too." "I'll take that as a compliment. Do we have a deal or not?" "We have a deal. Bring me the bank draft and I'll sign a document acknowledging full payment of the debt, no fees, no additional interest. But Miss Hart?" His eyes were hard. "Don't expect any neighborly consideration from me in the future. You've made an enemy today." "I already had an enemy," Evelyn said flatly. "At least now he's an enemy who can't steal my farm." The legal paperwork took another day to finalize, with a lawyer present to make sure everything was properly documented. But by the end of it, the debt was paid, the land was secure, and Blackwood had no legal claim on anything that belonged to the Harts. Evelyn walked out of the lawyer's office with the canceled note in her hand and felt like she could finally breathe again. "It's over," she said to Jack, who'd been waiting outside. "It's actually over. The farm is ours, free and clear." Jack swept her into his arms right there on Main Street, spinning her around while she laughed with pure relief and joy. "Damn right it's ours. And now that we've saved it, how about we make it official? Mrs. Evelyn Harlow has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" "I think it sounds perfect," Evelyn agreed, kissing him soundly despite the scandalized looks from passing townsfolk. "Let's go find the preacher. I'm ready to start our life together properly." The wedding was arranged for the following Saturday, giving them just enough time to let the neighbors know and make basic preparations. Mrs. Johnson insisted on helping, showing up with fabric for a new dress, and refusing to hear any arguments about Evelyn wearing her old clothes for such an important occasion. "Every bride deserves something special," Mrs. Johnson said firmly, pinning the fabric around Evelyn's waist. "Even practical farmers who think they're too busy for sentiment. Now hold still while I get these measurements." The dress came together over the next few days. Nothing fancy, just a simple design in soft blue cotton that brought out Evelyn's eyes, with lace at the collar that had belonged to Mrs. Johnson's mother. It was beautiful in its simplicity, and when Evelyn tried it on the night before the wedding, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. "You look beautiful," Jack said from the doorway, and Evelyn turned to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "I know I'm not supposed to see you before the wedding, but I couldn't wait." "Superstitious suddenly?" Evelyn teased, but she was blushing. "About some things, like making sure you know how much I love you before we make it legal tomorrow." He crossed to her, taking her hands. "Evelyn Hart, you're the strongest, bravest, most stubborn woman I've ever met. You saved this farm through sheer force of will and determination. You beat a rich bastard at his own game, and somehow, impossibly, you decided I was worth keeping around. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I promise I'm going to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that decision." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. "Jack Harlow, you rode into my life when I needed help most. You worked yourself nearly to death to help me keep a promise to my father. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You made me remember that life isn't just about surviving, it's about building something worth surviving for. I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I can't wait to be your wife." They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Evelyn thought that this moment right here, in her childhood home with the man she loved, was worth every struggle, every hardship, every moment of doubt and fear. The wedding itself was small, but perfect. The church was packed with neighbors and friends, the pews decorated with wheat sheaves instead of flowers, because that felt right, felt true to who they were. Evelyn walked down the aisle alone, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers, feeling her father's absence like a physical ache, but also feeling his pride in her accomplishment. Jack waited at the altar in his good suit, his hair neatly combed for once, his eyes never leaving her face as she approached. The preacher kept the ceremony short and simple, speaking about partnership and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. And when he asked Jack if he took Evelyn to be his lawfully wedded wife, Jack's "I do" rang out clear and strong. Evelyn's own "I do" was quieter, but no less certain. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers loud enough to shake the rafters. They held a small celebration afterward at the farm. Nothing fancy, just food and drink and neighbors gathering to wish them well. Mrs. Johnson had baked a cake, and Mr. Peterson had brought several bottles of his medicinal whiskey that turned out to be surprisingly good. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon there was music and dancing on the front porch while the sun set over the wheat fields. Evelyn danced with her new husband under the violet sky, his arms around her waist, her head on his shoulder, and felt happier than she'd ever thought possible. All around them, their neighbors celebrated, these people who'd come to help when help was needed, who'd shown up to save the harvest, who'd formed the community that made this hard life bearable. "Thank you," she whispered to Jack as they swayed to the music. "For what?" "For everything. For staying. For fighting. For making me believe in happy endings again." Jack pulled back just enough to look at her, and his smile was warm and real. "Evelyn Harlow, this isn't an ending. This is just the beginning. We've got years ahead of us, years of planting and harvesting, of watching our family grow, of building something that'll last long after we're gone. This story isn't over. It's just getting started." And he was right. The first year of their marriage brought good weather and better crops, and they expanded the fields slightly, planting corn in the north section where drainage was best. They bought 2 good breeding horses from a seller in Helena, starting the side business they'd talked about that night before the wheat sale. By autumn, Evelyn was pregnant, and by the following summer they welcomed a son they named Thomas, whose lungs were strong enough to be heard across the entire farm when he wanted to make himself known. 2 years later came a daughter they named Catherine, Kate for short, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. And 3 years after that, another boy they called James, sweet-tempered and curious about everything. The Hart Harlow farm prospered, slowly but steadily, becoming known throughout the territory for quality wheat and fine horses. Jack proved to be as good at business as he was at physical labor, negotiating fair prices and building relationships with buyers who respected his honesty. Evelyn managed the books and the household with equal competence, raising their children to understand the value of hard work and keeping promises. They added on to the house over the years, giving the children rooms of their own and building a proper workshop for Jack. They repaired the old barn and built a new one beside it. They planted trees around the family plot where Evelyn's parents rested, and sometimes in the evening, when the work was done, they'd walk out there together and tell Thomas Hart about his grandchildren, about the farm that was thriving, about the legacy he'd left behind. Blackwood left them alone after that first confrontation, though Evelyn heard he'd sold much of his holdings a few years later and moved east. The valley was better without him, she thought, and focused on her own family rather than dwelling on old enemies. The Johnsons remained close friends, their children growing up alongside the Harlow kids, playing in the wheat fields and learning to ride on the Hart Harlow horses. Mrs. Johnson became like a grandmother to Thomas, Kate, and James, spoiling them with sweets and wisdom in equal measure. As the years passed and the children grew, Evelyn would sometimes stand at the edge of the wheat fields and remember that desperate summer when she'd thought she'd lose everything. She'd remember her father's death, the impossible promise, the storm that nearly destroyed their salvation. And she'd remember the man who'd ridden up to her fence line offering to work for a promise instead of wages. The stranger who'd become her partner, her husband, her home. Jack would find her there sometimes, come up behind her and wrap his arms around her waist, and they'd stand together watching their children play, watching the wheat grow golden under the Montana sun, watching the life they'd built together flourish and grow. "What are you thinking about?" he'd ask, and Evelyn would lean back against his solid warmth. "Everything. Nothing. How far we've come. How lucky I am that you stopped at my fence that day." "I'm the lucky one," Jack would always say. "I was drifting, going nowhere, until I found you. You gave me a home, Evelyn. You gave me a purpose. You gave me a life worth living." And Evelyn would turn in his arms and kiss him, there in the golden fields with their children's laughter ringing like music, and think that this simple, hard-won happiness was everything her father had hoped for when he'd made her promise to save the farm. She'd kept that promise, but in keeping it, she'd gained so much more than just land and crops. She'd gained a partner who loved her, children who would carry on the legacy, and a community that supported them through good times and bad. She'd gained the knowledge that she was strong enough to face whatever challenges came, brave enough to fight for what mattered, and stubborn enough to never give up even when giving up seemed like the only option. The farm that Thomas Hart had built, that Evelyn had fought to save, would endure for generations. The wheat would grow and be harvested year after year, season after season. The land would pass to their children and their children's children, each generation adding their own strength and wisdom to the legacy. But more than that, the story of the cowboy who'd stopped to help a desperate woman save her father's harvest would become part of the valley's lore. People would tell it around campfires and dinner tables, embellishing it slightly with each retelling, until it became the kind of legend that inspired other people to show kindness to strangers, to keep fighting when things seemed hopeless, to believe that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. And isn't that what stories are for? Not just to record what happened, but to remind us what's possible when we refuse to give up, when we honor our promises, when we open our hearts to the possibility that sometimes the best things in life come from the hardest struggles. The sun set over the Hart Harlow farm, painting everything in shades of gold and copper and bronze, and the wheat whispered its approval in the evening wind. The harvest was done, the promise kept, the life built. And somewhere, Evelyn liked to think, her father was watching and smiling, proud of the daughter who'd kept her word and the man who'd helped her do it, proud of the grandchildren who bore his name and his stubborn heart spirit, proud of everything they'd built from that single desperate promise made at a dying man's bedside. The wheat would grow again next year, and the year after that, and all the years to come. The Hart Harlow family would endure, would prosper, would face their own challenges and their own triumphs. But tonight, in this perfect moment with the sunset painting the world gold and their children playing nearby and their arms around each other, Jack and Evelyn Harlow simply stood together and were grateful. For the farm they'd saved, for the love they'd found, for the life they'd built, one hard-won day at a time, from grief and determination and a promise kept against impossible odds. And that truly was enough. The two HTTPs www.youtube.com moms just watch VMWACBZTFC. Here's the same cinematic 5-part summary, now with a new main character name, Clara, Evelyn Hart, and all instances updated for full narrative consistency and freshness within your CB project. Title: The Cowboy Who Finished Her Father's Harvest. 1. Opening: The Last Promise. Montana Territory, late summer 1876. As the wheat turned gold beneath a cruel wind, Evelyn Hart watched her father take his final breath. "Promise me you won't lose the farm," he whispered. She swore she wouldn't, even as his hand went still in hers. The next morning, Evelyn stood alone before acres of uncut wheat, too much for one woman to save. Blisters split open as she swung her father's old scythe through the field, her body screaming against the impossible. Then, through the glare of the noonday sun, a lone rider appeared, a tall stranger on a chestnut horse who slowed at the fence line. "Name's Jack Harlow," he called. "Heard this place needs a hand for harvest." Evelyn straightened, breath ragged. "I can't pay you." Jack dismounted, eyes steady. "Then don't. Let me work for what's fair, after we bring it in." That was how a promise born in grief met the man who would keep it. 2. Rising action. The stranger who stayed. Jack worked with quiet endurance, his limp barely slowing the rhythm of his swing. By dusk, neat rows of cut grain trailed behind him like golden rivers. In the farmhouse, Evelyn cooked stew while he cleaned his hands at the pump, manners as polished as his calluses were rough. When he spoke of Kansas, of drought and debt, of losing everything but his pride, she heard a familiar ache. They shared stories by lamplight, two souls stitched together by loss. Each morning before dawn, she found him sharpening the scythe, humming softly. Each night, he left a bundle of wheat tied and stacked by her father's grave. Respect, not charity. But when a sudden storm flooded the fields, Jack's old injury gave out. Evelyn dragged him inside, wrapping his swollen leg in herbal cloth the way her mother once had. You've done enough, she whispered. Jack met her eyes. Not till your father's harvest is finished. 3. Climax. The storm and the confession. Rain beat against the roof as thunder rolled across the plains. Trapped inside, they talked through the night. She spoke of childhood winters when the roof leaked and the beds froze to the floorboards. He told her of the ocean, how it felt endless but kind. By morning, the storm eased. But before they could return to work, he confessed what he'd hidden. I wasn't passing through by chance, Jack said quietly. 3 years ago, my cattle trampled part of this farm. Your father forgave me, made me coffee, told me about his daughter who could outthink half the men in Montana. When I heard he'd passed, I came to make it right. Evelyn's throat tightened. So you came because of him? At first, he admitted, but I stayed because of you. Outside, the sky darkened again. As wind whipped the uncut stalks, she whispered, "Then let's finish it together." By sundown, they were side by side, fighting the storm, saving what they could. In the barn's flickering lantern light afterward, soaked and trembling, she kissed him, the kind of kiss that sealed more than gratitude. 4. Resolution. The field is done. The next days passed in fierce labor. Neighbors who had doubted her now stopped to watch as Evelyn and Jack worked the final rows. When the last stalk fell, Jack leaned on the scythe and said softly, "Your father's crop. It's done." Tears glimmered in Evelyn's eyes. "You kept my promise." He shook his head. "No, you did." That night, beneath a sky brushed in violet dust, they sat on the porch. "I meant to go west to Oregon," he confessed, "but Oregon doesn't have you." Evelyn laughed through her tears. "You don't even know what you're signing up for." Jack smiled. "A woman with more grit than any man I've met? I think I do." The preacher married them a month later, the church filled with neighbors and wheat sheaves instead of flowers. When he kissed his bride, the congregation cheered loud enough to shake the rafters. 5. Breakthrough and ending. The harvest that lasted. Winter came early that year, but the Hart Harlow farm thrived. They rebuilt the roof, repaired the fences, and planted anew in spring, side by side, partners in every sense. By the next harvest, Evelyn's hands were no longer blistered but strong, steady. Jack cut while she bound, their laughter echoing through the golden fields her father had once dreamed of. Years later, with a child on her hip and another chasing fireflies through the stubble, Evelyn stood beside Jack at her father's grave. "He gave us this land," she said softly. Jack squeezed her hand. "And somehow, he gave me you." As the sun set over the fields, the wind rustled the wheat like applause. The harvest was long finished, but its legacy, love, and labor intertwined would never end.